Recently I did my worst feature of each expansion video, which you should totally check out, I'll link it below, and I already knew whilst I was making that I wanted to do the opposite and talk about what for me was the best feature of each expansion too. With World of Warcraft coming up to its 20th anniversary this year, there are so many things to celebrate about this game and its many additions that have been added throughout the expansions, which have kept, certainly me, and many others coming back again and again. So let's do this, one-ish of the best features from each expansion World of Warcraft has seen in its near 20-year history. Starting from the start in vanilla then, of course. And this has to be the easiest one on this list for me by a mile, because vanilla for me has always been about the leveling journey, and I think that's the thing which it does better than any other expansion, and that remains true to this day. Where it's different here is that it just starts in a way that no other expansion can emulate, because they are all expansions. They're starting you when you're at the previous level cap, you're geared up, you have a bunch of gold and so on. In vanilla, when you make a new character, that's it. You're level 1, you have none of your abilities, and you have the entire world in front of you. You're a small character in a big world which can eventually do great things. The leveling can be slow, it can be grueling, I'm not going to argue with that, but it certainly is rewarding. And that feeling of starting as a small character and gradually rising your way up through the ranks in levels, abilities, in gear and so on are all part of what make the vanilla leveling experience so memorable. Also, the actual world in vanilla, as in Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor, is absolutely massive too, and it really lends itself to the scope of this journey. But for vanilla, the best feature has to be the leveling. On to the Burning Crusade then, World of Warcraft's first expansion, and many changes being made to the game. And for TBC, I'm probably going to pick something a bit different from what most of people would have picked. And my choice for the best feature of Burning Crusade as an expansion is actually going to be the tier set appearances. There's one exception to this, which is the Season 4 Brutal Gladiator set, and that was because with all the other PvP seasons, they just recolored the PvE set, but in Season 4 they didn't have the chance to do this because Sunwell just added new tier pieces to tier 6. So as a result, we're just going to pretend that Season 4 gear just doesn't exist and look at everything else that was made in TBC. Now, the tier set bonuses back then tended to be pretty boring, to be honest. They were just a few more percentages on a damaging ability or something. But appearance-wise, pretty much everything in TBC just looks amazing. And if Kata and Beyond you're transmogging into anything from TBC, you're doing something right in my book. There are just so many iconic sets that really fit with each class's feel. You have the Malefic set for Warlocks with the wings that pop out when you jump, Paladin's Lightbringer with their halo, Warrior's Onslaught set with its spikes and how well it matches up with the Bulwark of Azinoth. TBC sets were so good, they reimagined them and brought them back during Tier 20, the Tomb of Sargeras during Legion. You know, Blizzard, you could get away with reimagining basically every tier set from TBC, and I'm pretty sure people will love that. Next up, Wrath of the Lich King, an expansion which changed a lot in the World of Warcraft, and maybe one which, having replayed it now in Classic, people have come to have different opinions on what was so good about Wrath of the Lich King. But my choice for this expansion has to be the alt friendliness that it introduced. Now, with warbands in the War Within, making this statement is kind of difficult right now because warbands are just so much better in, well, pretty much every single way imaginable, but back then Wrath of the Lich King was the peak for player alt friendliness, and it also being the peak for subcounts as a result ain't much of a surprise. The word Flavor of the Month reroller became popular during Wrath because big class changes came with each major patch, and people could really quickly switch from one class onto the new and overpowered one. You could easily gear up through heroics, though there was no looking for dungeon system till towards the end of the expansion, and there was a lot of standing around in Dalaran spamming need a tank. Tier 7 was so easy that practically anybody could get through it and pick up some degree of gear between 10 and 25 man. There was the Vault of Archivon for some more epics, and the emblem system to give you a way to eventually work towards pieces of gear. People even called epics back then welfare epics because items items were just so plentiful and easy to get. Wrath of the Lich King for the time was the moment when the game became the most alt-friendly and the fastest to get into and pick up a new class. It's really no wonder why it was so popular back in the day. And then the shattering happens and we go into the Cataclysm. My favourite feature of this expansion, having played it back in the day and now having replayed it partially now, has pretty much remained the same and definitely met my expectations. My choice for Cataclysm is without a doubt the changes made to how healing worked in World of Warcraft. So Vanilla, TBC and Wrath, we have healers pressing a few buttons. In Vanilla they downranked as well. It became more difficult to go thanks to world buffs early on and then upgrading your gear in later expansions. And it was kind of whack-a-mole gameplay where people took spikes of damage and then you race with all your other healers to top that health bar off. In Cataclysm, Blizzard changed this format considerably. Healers now have a bunch of different buttons to press with different mana efficiency to meet different demands. Does somebody need a heal now? Can you be more efficient? Are they going to take large amounts of damage? Each healer could feel out the situation that was about to happen damage-wise and which button is best to use. There are a lot more defensive cooldowns which just feel good to press in a raiding environment, and it feels as though you're really doing something that contributes to the raid. And mana management is absolutely a thing as well. If you tried to play Disc Priest as you do in Wrath of the Lich King, where you just spammed power word shield, you would go in 30 seconds and everyone would be wondering what you're doing. For me, Cataclysm was an expansion which really grew the healer playstyle and offered a lot more skill expression for the role. I played a healer back in original Cata, Resto Druid, and this time around I'm playing Resto Druid and Holy Paladin, and it's very much been what I expected it to be. So for me, Cataclysm is all about the healing rework. Following that, we have the Mists of Pandaria, an expansion with loads of different things to love. And though it was harshly criticised back in the day, we look back now and see an expansion which had a lot of positives about it. For me, the pick for Mists of Pandaria is going to be Blizzard opening up way more horizontal content when outside in the open world to do, apart from just a raid or PvP. Mists of Pandaria was the biggest jump in new content the game had seen so far, alongside the additions made in Wrath and Cata, such as achievements and archaeology. Now in Mists of Pandaria we had things such as the Brawlers Guild, challenge modes, way more collection content out in the open world, the Isle of Thunder and its little treasure collection minigame and all the things to do there, and later on the Timeless Isle where there was basically always something that you needed to get from there. There was the battle pet system too, which I've always personally enjoyed a lot, and overall there was just much more stuff to do outside of the gameplay loop of raid and PvP. Mists of Pandaria was the biggest jump in this regard the game has seen so far, and for that reason, that's why it's my pick for this expansion. And then we go back to the future in Warlords of Draenor. For an expansion people would generally rate pretty lowly, there are some things to like about it for sure. Now I could very much mention the raids throughout this expansion as they're generally well loved by the community, but I feel as though whatever the expansion, the raiding content in this game is usually pretty good, so I don't really want to settle for that for an answer. I also think Warlords of Draenor is worthy of some honourable mentions. It was the first expansion to introduce mythic raiding into the game, a new format of raiding which would be fixed to 20 players that would be the ultimate difficulty for the highest skill players. And yes, Siege of Orgrimmar was technically the first mythic raid, but it was in the WoD pre-patch, so I'm counting it as a WoD feature. I think having this ultimate difficulty has met the demands of different types of players and has also eventually given us things to watch such as the race to world first, so I think mythic mode's pretty cool. I'd also like to mention Warlords of Draenor introduced time walking as a concept. I mean, in Warlords of Draenor they didn't necessarily make that much new stuff compared to many other expansions, but I think the idea of allowing us to go back in time and to see other expansions' content was always going to be a good idea. A lot of people have started World of Warcraft at different points in time, so for many people it would have been new content. And here's a scary thought, Warlords of Draenor was the halfway mark in WoW's 20-year age nowadays. It came out in 2014. But my pick for Warlords of Draenor overall has to be, and what I think was ultimately the best feature, was the rework to leveling. Moving from vanilla into TBC and especially Wrath of the Lich King, leveling started to get a bit different with the smaller landmass, and it was often quite linear, whilst not also having those story elements that future expansions would. Now this changed quite a bit in Cataclysm when Blizzard reworked the entire world, but Warlords of Draenor was a bunch of changes on top of that system. And I have to say, looking back to Warlords of Draenor, and whenever I went to replay it, the bit of the expansion I would look forwards to would be the leveling. It would always be super fast. You'd get into the expansion, you'd do the opening of Shadowmoon Valley, go into Gorgrond, clear the bonus objectives, kill all the monsters that drop a quest item, hand everything in, do the bonus objectives in Spires of Iraq, and boom, you're done. You're out of the expansion already and on your way into Legion. And you could hit level cap well before clearing the map in Warlords of Draenor 2. And that's why for me, Warlords of Draenor's best feature has to have been the changes it made to leveling. And then we move on to Legion, an expansion where I think I'm the most spoiled for choice out of any version of World of Warcraft so far. I've had some easy answers in some expansions so far, but here there's a lot of different things to think about. Do I want to go for the class order halls, which were just thematically brilliant? Perhaps Soromar, still to this day, I would say the best open world zone that's ever been made, with a good story alongside it that progressed leading up to the raid in the zone. What about the overall story in Legion though? How about that moment when we defeat Kil'jaeden and we find that Illidan has brought Argus close to Azeroth so we can take the fight to them? That really must be one of the most epic story moments in World of Warcraft. These are all good choices, and there are probably even more choices worthy of a pick in Legion, but for me, I'm gonna have to go for artifact weapons. The reason I'm picking these, I think, is because they could have been an absolute disaster if they didn't go well. No weapon upgrades for an entire expansion sounded kind of like madness going into it when usually there's such a big deal, and potentially would have people with the same weapon appearances and we just wouldn't be able to stand out, but Blizzard made it work. Now admittedly, artifact weapons weren't the best early game because you had to put artifact power into them and then you'd try and change spec and work on another one and you'd have to go and grind again. They fixed this later with artifact knowledge, increasing the amount of artifact power you could get, but that was kind of the key negative to them in my opinion. The quests to pick up artifact weapons were fun to do too, and when you got them they gave so many fun and impactful abilities, such as Odin's Fury for Fury Warriors, Stormkeeper for Elemental Shaman, Soul Flame for Affliction Lock, Phoenix Flames for Fire Mage, and many more. And there were loads of different appearances for these weapons too, from a variety of content, from open world, raids, PvP, there were hidden appearances with mini quests tied into them, and then later on there were the Mage Tower appearances as well, as a bit of a flex if you got them early on, and something that everyone could work towards in time and over gear. And in a later patch we had more abilities added to our artifact weapons too, and they were truly a tier of weapon above legendaries. These were artifacts. We wielded Doomhammer, the Ashbringer, Fellow Malorn, and so many more. Legion absolutely knocked class fantasy out of the park, and artifact weapons for me were a big part of that. And then we get on to BFA, an expansion which has, well, less choices than Legion, shall we say. My pick for BFA is going to be the allied races. Now hold on, before you say weren't they added in Legion, they kind of were. They were added in patch 7.3.5, but you needed to have pre-ordered BFA in order to get them, so I'm gonna count them as a BFA feature. Allied races added a bunch more customization into the game, new appearances that we hadn't seen before, and it allowed to match your class and role to the race which you felt as though it fit with the most thematically. And since then it's been a system that's been built on loads with tons of new additions each expansion. Also there's the whole quest to get allied races in the first place, which give you a nice bit of lore and background. So overall I think allied races have been a good addition to the game. Next up we have Shadowlands, and Shadowlands is actually a really easy one for me to pick the best part of it. So there was this thing that happened quite late into the expansion. It was actually after the final patch called Dragonflight. Okay, but for real, there were some good things about Shadowlands too, whatever people say about it. I think one of the better features of the expansion were the customization updates made to your character. The character creation screen was updated, and there were just generally a ton more options in the game. I think another good addition this expansion made was Chromie Time, or the Time Walking campaigns, because by this point in time, if you're a newer player to World of Warcraft, it must have been incredibly confusing to try and level through this game. You'd get halfway through a zone or a story or, you know, an expansion, you'd start to over-level everything, and then you just stop earning experience, which is any good, and then you need to try and work out where to go next. Chromie Time made it so you could go pick an expansion, level there, see what it's all about, and then when you're high enough level, you can move on to the Shadowlands content. There was also Exile's Reach as a new alternative starter zone, which I kind of find people either really love it or they don't like it. I have to say I definitely prefer the more race-specific starter zones rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, but it was something new to experience for newer players as well. Overall, I think the customization options and Chromie Time were both good updates from the Shadowlands, and overall I'm gonna have to pick Chromie Time. And then we get on to Dragonflight, where I have a quick honourable mention for Awakened raids. Blizzard have been struggling for years to give people a valuable reason to go back to old raids during the life cycle of an expansion to get a bit more, well, content out of them. When a raid becomes Awakened, it offers a higher level of difficulty and better loot, and it just generally gives people a reason to go back and see older content, or perhaps for people who have joined the expansion a bit later to have the same reason to be able to go back. So I think Awaken raids were a great idea, but my choice overall for Dragonflight is Dragon Riding, and this one is a complete no-brainer. For me, it really fit with the theme of the expansion. There were so many big open zones, it feels so fast to get around, there's weight to your mounts, and they just feel good to use. It's much more interactive than hopping on your mount, pressing your auto run button, and then going to get a drink or something. I've been playing some War Within recently, and when I hop on Cataclysm, mount up, and then press my Skyward Ascent button, and nothing happens, and I'm like, oh yeah, we don't have that here, do we? Wish we did. Blizzard also tied in more content to Dragon Riding, such as the customization for mounts and the various ways you can pick up those customizations, as well as the Dragon Riding races. Just overall a very good bit of content, fit well with the expansion, and it's something I'm glad they've extended to other mounts now. And then finally we have the War Within. Again, it's hard to pick something when we're so early into the expansion, but I picked something for the worst video, so I'm gonna pick something for the best video as well. And for me, at this very early stage, what I think people will look back to in the War Within and say this was the best feature will be warbands. It's just a much smoother user experience having all your characters on one page, and the game figures out the server for you rather than you having to swap about. You get to pick your favorite characters and have them on the screen. Not exactly the first MMO to do this, but it's a cool feature either way. You can trade typically untradeable things cross-character, such as currencies. You can work towards renown, quest completion, and so on multiple different characters, so even when you're playing your ults, you're doing something which is worthwhile for your main too. And warbands just makes it so there's this constant feeling of progression and working towards something, and that's a large factor in MMOs, and that's why for me at this early stage in the War Within, I'm gonna pick warbands. Over the years, Blizzard has introduced so many different updates to World of Warcraft. Some of them have stuck around and become reoccurring features that we would see in many different expansions. Others would fall by the wayside and be forgotten about. For some of these updates, we've been glad to see the back of them, whilst others have always seemed as though they are ideal candidates to one day bring back to World of Warcraft. But what were the best updates that Blizzard ever made to World of Warcraft that they just decided not to bring back? Whether it was they just didn't fit into the current expansion, or maybe they hadn't gotten around to bringing them back yet. These have to be the best World of Warcraft features that Blizzard have forgotten about. First, at number 10, we have a feature from Cataclysm, Reforging. What Reforging would allow you to do is to reallocate 40% of a secondary stat on one item into a different stat, including Spirit back then, even though that was technically a primary stat in Cata. This was super useful, as even if an item didn't really have the stats you wanted, you could still get a good amount of use out of it and feel good about getting an upgrade. Now, if I'm honest, Reforging made more sense at the time than it would necessarily now in modern World of Warcraft, because there were just more stats that you needed to hit back then. During the expansions when Reforging existed, you still had to worry about things such as hit and expertise cap, and being able to swap around some stats when you got a new piece of gear made hitting those breakpoints much easier. But during the start of Warlords of Draenor, stats in WoW under underwent a big overhaul and were simplified a lot. And when I say simplified, I mean removed. Alongside this, reforging as a feature also left the game never to return. Still, even if it were in the game nowadays, it would be nice to get an extra bit of your most valuable secondary stat from gear, but I can see at the same time why it's not in the game. At number 9, I've got something which I think will be a bit controversial, but hear me out, and that's faction-specific classes. This was only a feature during vanilla, of course, when Alliance had the Paladins and Horde had Shaman. Thematically, it did make sense back then, as the shamanistic dwarves that existed in the world with a wild hammer, and they were their own faction within the Alliance, and on the Horde, Tauren Sunwalkers were not a thing yet. And I must admit, I do like factions having access to different things. I think the differences between the two keep things interesting. Of course, though, the problem always arises when we get to the inevitable question of balance. And seeing Season of Discovery at the moment, I can go and read daily posts about how X class on Y faction is overpowered. And at the same time, it would be a shame to enjoy playing on one faction in particular, but also to be locked out of playing a certain class there. But in modern World of Warcraft, this isn't really a concern either way, because pretty much everything is cross-faction. In fact, we got to the state of the game where everything needed to be cross-faction, with both factions having both classes at the same time since 2007. Maybe it would have happened a lot sooner were this not the case, but racials alone were enough to cause the imbalance over time. Whenever we get around to World of Warcraft's next class though, I highly doubt it will be faction-specific, as they would kind of need to do two classes at once, one for the Horde and one for the Alliance, and that sounds like an absolute balancing nightmare for Blizzard. So I'll say, in the past I enjoyed faction-specific classes, but I do see why they're gone. At number 8, I've got something from Battle for Azeroth, which is probably not an expansion you were expecting to see here, but this was an idea Blizzard had to tell the story of a raid where you would transform mid-raid into the other faction's races for certain encounters. I'm of course talking about the battle for Dazar Allure, and this wasn't just a visual change, you full-on swapped racials and everything. Horde players would be changed to Alliance for the Treasure Room fight, Conclave of the Chosen and King Rastakhan, whilst Alliance players would become Horde for High Tinker Mechatalk, Stormwall Blockade, and Jaina Proudmoore. At least Blizzard realised for the harder M bosses that players should be Horde for all of them. After all, Horde had historically had better racials for PvE than Alliance for, well, let's just say many years in a row. Can you imagine if the Race to World First players were forced to play Alliance for a tier and not to have those extra bonuses that they're used to? I'm sure that would have caused some drama. At the same time, and as somebody who progressed this content on Mythic, you got a taste of playing the other faction and seeing how things were on the other side of the fence with all those different bonuses. Overall, I think Battle for Dazar Allure was an interesting idea with the swap both from a mechanical and story point of view. I don't know if this race change mid-raid would make sense in World of Warcraft ever again, but if it ever did, I'd be down to see it return. On 7th, I've got class quests. So these were mainly a key feature of vanilla, where as you gradually gain levels and went back to your class trainer to get your new abilities, sometimes you would see your trainer had that infamous yellow exclamation mark above their head and a brand new quest for you. The game didn't exactly tell you when this was going to happen because it's vanilla. You just had to go figure stuff out for yourself, or, well, back in the day you Thoughtbot. But these quests could range from a whole host of different things. Sometimes you got a powerful new piece of armor or a weapon, to learning abilities which defined your class, such as the Bear Shapeshift for druids or summoning new demons for warlocks. And at level count there were some truly amazing class quests too, notably ones for Paladin to summon a charger or the Dreadsteed for a warlock as a replacement to your standard epic mount. And of course hunters and priests could both loot an item from Major Domo Executus in Molten Core to start off a huge quest chain to get their hands on an epic weapon which will last them for a good while. During Legion class quests kind of made a return in the form of quests you had to do in order to get your artifact weapons, and in Dragonflight there were a bunch of new customization options opened up for a number of classes through, well, they weren't quite quests, but things to go and farm in the open world. These will give you new appearances for things such as your shapeshift forms for druids or demons for warlocks, just for example. Either way, I think class quests were a cool addition to the game, and updates that reinforce class fantasy tend to go down very well in WoW, as we'll talk about later. At 6, I've got challenge modes. So challenge modes were first added in Mists of Pandaria as a new difficulty for dungeons. Up until Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard had a bit of a problem with 5-man content. They were a core feature of WoW and something that had to be updated for each expansion, but they were only really super popular for a short period of time at the start of the expansion when everyone needed to gear. After that, they were only really used for leveling, and even heroic dungeons could eventually be skipped by just buying any old stuff from the auction house and going straight into LFR. So Blizzard came up with a solution, and along came challenge modes. These dungeons would give you a set item level, so gear wasn't as impactful as it usually is. There was also a gold, silver, bronze medal system for completing dungeons within certain time brackets, alongside unique rewards, most notably the transmog sets from Mists of Pandaria, which have still never made a return to the game, and they didn't even come back for Mists of Pandaria Remix, so at this point I don't think we're ever getting them back. Early on during MOP, there were temporary titles too for holding the fastest completion of a challenge mode on your realm, such as Dark Master for Scholomance, Siegebreaker for Temple of New Zao, and so on. Challenge modes would continue throughout Warlords of Draenor 2, before eventually being revamped into the Mythic Plus system in Legion, where dungeons would instead begin to scale and become an ever-rising challenge with bigger and better rewards. What I do like about challenge modes in comparison though is that the gear was set so you could just go into them. It was a different type of challenge, and everyone has the same challenge in terms of difficulty and item level. I doubt they're really going to make a return, but I think challenge modes are a good feature. At 5, I've got something that's been experimented with over the years, but each time it happened it kept getting a bit smaller scale, and that is server-wide events. Now these do still kind of happen, and I think the closest thing we get to them are pre-patch events, where there's things such as Legion invasions, Radiant Echoes, that kind of thing. These are really events that get people from all over the server together and into the same place for a common objective. But when I'm talking about these server or realm-wide events, what I mean are things which will be progressed in a different way on each server, such as the opening of the Gates of Anchorage or the Isle of Quel'Danas during the Burning Crusade. During these type of events, certain things had to happen on your specific server for them to be progressed. For AQ, it was assembling the Scepter of the Shifting Sands and the war effort material gathering, and then after that you had the 10-hour war in Silithus and all the drama that ensued. It was by far the most ambitious world event WoW has ever seen, and the first for that matter. But the Isle of Quel'Danas tried the event in a much more tame way. Your server simply had to complete X number of daily quests to progress the event and open up some new vendors and quests and so on, and eventually it would culminate in your raid being unlocked on your server. At least that's how it worked back in the day. During TBC Classic we just got the raid day 1, but we did have to wait for some things such as the epic gem vendors, for example. These days though, the landscape and the server structure of WoW has changed so much. How would a server-wide event look when you can group up with people cross-server or even cross-faction now? And what about the fact that when there's about 50 or so people on your screen, the game just still stops working and lags terribly? I don't know if you've done a world boss yet in the War Within, but this really hasn't improved ever. I think server-wide events are a super cool feature, and they really capture the scale of the amount of players that are in MMOs, and that's a big part of what it's all about. Then again, maybe it's difficult for Blizzard to pull off these events in-game, but players can still organize, especially on RP servers, and put on events which bring people together and embody the spirit of the MMO. At number 4, I have something which has come back to the game, it's just nowhere near as good as it used to be, and this is about speed sets for farming legacy content. So speed was a tertiary stat that was added in Warlords of Draenor. Sometimes gear would randomly upgrade and you would get this stat on it, and as it suggested, it would improve your movement speed by a small amount, with diminishing returns the more of the stat you got. Now it was in Legion when a certain food item was added into the game that would increase your movement speed massively, and it was called Bear Tartar. Upon killing an enemy you would gain 70% movement speed for 5 seconds, and unlike many other effects in the game which needed you to have killed an enemy which grants honor or experience, this food didn't. It worked on anything. And the good times for Bear Tartar lasted all the way throughout Legion, and then we got to BFA and Blizzard hit the fun detected button and nerfed this food down from a 70% speed increase down to a flat 250 speed speed, which in other words means it didn't really do anything anymore. But in Shadowlands, Blizzard brought in a new speed food item called fried bonefish that would give you some speed rating after killing a target. It was nowhere near 70% of course, but it was a new item and it was better than nothing, so people began to use that. Nowadays in the War Within, trying both these items out, Bear Tartar gives under 100 speed and basically a 1% bonus, and fried bonefish around 850 speed or a 5% bonus. Nothing like these items used to be for speed sets, but I guess it is better than nothing. Either way, it seems as though Legion was the only expansion where we could go through old raids and dungeons faster than we could with an epic mount. At number 3 I've got a feature from Legion, and one which is still in the game to complete, it's just never been given a Season 2 treatment. I'm of course talking about the Mage Tower. Now I'm not sure if you tried Mage Tower in the War Within recently, probably best not to by the way, the scaling seems extremely bad, and the challenges are probably harder than they were day one using LFR gear, but it is a feature that's well loved by the community nonetheless. Originally releasing on patch 7.2, Mage Tower was a new solo PvE challenge mode to WoW that would pit players against difficult encounters. On release, Mage Tower was also one of a few different buildings which you could contribute to with a resource. Before the Legion would then destroy it and you had to contribute to it again and have it rebuilt, so the event wasn't available all the time. On top of that, after your first attempt, all future attempts would cost 100 nether shards each, meaning you would have to go out there and farm a currency in order to keep trying on these difficult challenges, though nether shards weren't too hard to get though, especially early on in the patch. Later on in World of Warcraft, the Mage Tower would instead be made a permanent feature which you could just access, and the rewards were, first of all, just having beaten the challenge. These things early on were not easy, and some of the challenges for certain specs felt as though they were extremely tightly tuned. And secondly, you get a brand new appearance for your artifact weapon so you can show off that you've beat this new challenge. And as much as Mage Tower is a feature that still does exist, and I'm sure Blizzard will get around to tuning it in the War Within, it's had the same challenges for over 7 years in a row now, and I'm sure no one would say no to a new set of challenges from this well-loved bit of content. At number 2 I've got another feature from Legion, the Class Order Halls. Class Order Halls were an integral feature during Legion, and would tie in so many aspects of class flavor and fantasy that Blizzard were aiming for during this expansion. It seemed as though initially it would have been a disastrous idea. We were going to be splitting the player base based upon their classes into their own instances, and this had the potential to make the open world seem a lot smaller and less populated, which in an MMO isn't what you want, but they just worked. Class Order Halls were a home away from home for each class. Hunters had their lodge in the open air, druids a nature-filled grove complete with the Emerald Dreamway, mages a hall of learning, and warlocks a home of a conquered pit lord. And there was a lot to do there too. There was the mission table, which made a somewhat uneasy return from Warlords of Draenor, but it wasn't nearly as impactful, and you could work towards a unique class armor set, specific quests, and more. It was also in the Class Order Hall we upgraded and customized your artifact weapon, which for me were another great feature of Legion, and I don't know if they could really ever bring them back now that the power of those weapons is in the past and we use them to defeat the Burning Legion, but they were just another factor which really added to the success of Legion. Were Blizzard to bring back Class Order Halls in one way or another, I'm sure it would be a success. There's just the one small issue that rogues in particular are going to probably need to find a new sewer somewhere, because that one in Dalaran probably isn't looking all too hot after, well, what happens at the start of the War Within. And number 1 on my list, and the feature that I want to see return to the game the most, is the Brawlers Guild. Originally added at the start of Mists of Pandaria, Brawlers Guild was a nice piece of endgame side content, added in to give players something more to do outside of PvP and PvE, which really had been the bulk of endgame for a long time in WoW. The Brawlers Guild was held in the arena in the Valley of Honor, as well as in a new passageway underneath the Deep Run tram. The concept was simple: you versus an ever-growing challenge that would put your skills to the test. It was kind of like the Mage Tower with an audience, and the audience were the players. You'd also have to queue up and wait your turn. It was World of Warcraft PvE as a spectator sport inside the game. Each battle would would last for 2 minutes before you were blown up and thrown out of the arena, and some of the tougher ones were real DPS and mechanic checks, even for better geared players at the time, and people watching on could cheer for you, they could buy stuff from vendors to throw at you, they could see how a boss should be done, or maybe how not to do a boss as well. There wasn't just rising through the ranks of the standard challenges too, you could get special challenge cards from a variety of activities, such as quests, pet battles and more. These will let you instantly access a fight, ranging from the easy for fun ones to some of the hardest battles that would pose a big challenge. And the Brawlers Guild has seen a few comebacks throughout the history of WoW. It was updated in Warlords of Draenor to keep it relevant, and it also saw an appearance during Legion and BFA, but since the Shadowlands we have been deprived of the Brawlers Guild and are yet to see it return. I really think this features a bit of genius and that it would fit into pretty much any version of WoW, and I really mean that. So I'm hoping we see the Brawlers Guild return, maybe even during the War Within, you never know. A bit ago I did a video listing what was for me the worst dungeon out of each and every World of Warcraft expansion so far, and at the time I already knew I wanted to do a video with the best dungeon from every expansion too, so here we are. World of Warcraft's 5-player content has always been the building blocks that really get your character going, from just an adventure in a big world to taking steps into real combat encounters with amazing loot, and of course engaging with other people in this massively multiplayer world. Over time dungeons have definitely become something more as well, with heroic mode being introduced in TBC, and then later challenge modes, mythic, and of course mythic plus. So I think now is a good time to commemorate World of Warcraft's absolute best 5-player content. Today I'm going to be covering what I feel is the best dungeon from all WoW expansions so far, and I'll also be listing by order of how good the dungeons are, instead of by the expansions in order, because I feel for this list it just makes a bit more sense this way. This means the expansions with the weakest to best dungeon will be first in the list, and the expansions with the absolute top tier best dungeons will be later. So with that said, let's make a start. We'll begin in what will soon be our next stop for the modern WoW classic games with Mists of Pandaria. Now I think I made it clear in videos before that I think Mists of Pandaria really doesn't have very good dungeons, as in at all for that matter. Back then Blizzard were obsessed with putting in time-gated bosses and lengthy RP in the middle of the dungeons, which is fine the first few times throughout the dungeons, but if you play a bunch of characters or you just like spamming dungeons to level, it gets really boring really fast. I kind of want to give the award to Shadowpan Monastery, as the setting is just so cool with the monks training up in the snowy hills in their hidden monastery, but then I remember the first boss has you AFK while he talks to some giant snake thing, and then you have to go and do the mini combat arena before the second boss too, and these things just really slow down the pace of the dungeon. For Mists of Pandaria I feel as though I'm trying to find a dungeon where you can actually just play the game with minimal interruption, and I think the closest I can get is Mogasham Palace. So yes, the first boss is the Trial of the King, where you are surrounded and have to wait for the bosses to slowly walk out of the crowd towards you, but by Mists of Pandaria standards this is a fairly fast event, and the rest of the dungeon has few interruptions, with you being able to blast down the second boss after you jump off the ledge nearby him and engage him directly with the trash. And this was pretty easy to do because heroics and Mists of Pandaria were not exactly known for their difficulty. Finally you have Zin the Weapon Master as the last boss, and that one was pretty fun too. He would unleash tons of different weapons as the fight progressed, which could make the rooms super chaotic, though I seem to remember there were certain safe spots where you could just plant yourself and rarely need to move. A lot of Mists of Pandaria dungeons do have potential with their theme and setting, it's just a shame when it comes down to the actual gameplay it's often interrupted by uninterruptible scenes. So more or less based entirely upon having the fewest interruptions I can think of throughout a dungeon, the pick for me here is Mogasham Palace. Oh, next is a fairly recent addition to the World of Warcraft universe in Dragonflight. The pick for this expansion for me is the Azure Vault. In an expansion with so much vibrance and colour, I have to say there weren't really that many standout dungeons for me when it came to replayability, which I'm kind of surprised that I'm saying that, to be honest. But the Azure Vault for me was the best addition from Dragonflight, with an interesting follow-up to the story of the Azure Span, unique bosses, and overall amazing visuals. In fact, the look and feel of the Azure Vault are really what tip the scales and make it as the top pick for this expansion. You start towards the top of the vault and gradually make your way down, uncovering the various secrets it holds before the final encounter with a crystal-infused dragon. Overall, the Azure Vault was one of the most memorable dungeons from Dragonflight for me, and one that I don't half mind going back to replay now and again, so that's why it's my pick here. Next up is Warlords of Draenor. I think the WoD actually has a bunch of worthy choices, but the pick I'm going with for this expansion is going to be the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Shadowmoon Burial Grounds are one of the earlier dungeons you will encounter in this expansion, and it has you visit an ancestral resting place to take care of Ner'zhul and his minions who have desecrated this place with void magic. You start off towards the entrance of the burial grounds and gradually fight your way through the void minions, undead, and members of the Shadowmoon clan. I think it does a good job of capturing the feeling of being inside a massive underground complex, and the lingering shadows inside add a bunch to the atmosphere. Awaiting at the end is one of the Warlords of Draenor himself, Ner'zhul, who is casting some kind of massive ritual, though the most memorable part of the fight is definitely him spamming that one voice line whenever he summons the Wall of Skeletons. Overall, Shadowmoon Burial Grounds is a solid dungeon, has good bosses, and is one that captures the theme that it is going for very well, so based on that, it gets my pick for Warlords of Draenor. Now we have the War Within, and I know that Blizzard are still going to be releasing new dungeons throughout the expansion, but there's one in particular so far where I feel as though it stands out, so I wanted to give it a mention here, and that is Darkflame Cleft. Kobolds have become a bit more than just crazy rats hanging out in mines since vanilla, and now indeed are a major race of the War Within, and in Darkflame Cleft we get to see why they put so much importance on always having a candlelight with them at all times. The first half of the dungeon is just fine, having you battle through various encounters, but it's the end part where I think this dungeon does a really good job. The fight with the darkness plunges you into just that, complete pitch black, where your only salvation is what kobolds have relied upon since forever, a simple, albeit massive candle. From the shadows beasts skitter and assault you before you finally take on the darkness itself. I just thought it was cool how the kobold's obsession with candles and fear of the dark was made into something real in the WoW universe, and here for me it made for a memorable dungeon, so that's why Darkflame Cleft is the pick in the War Within for me. Next up, we're heading very far back in time, all the way to World of Warcraft's first ever expansion, the Burning Crusade. TBC of course was when heroic dungeons were first introduced into World of Warcraft, a brand new difficulty which aimed to provide a greater challenge in exchange for greater loot, and TBC heroics definitely lived up to their name. There were trash mobs that hit harder than bosses, punishing mechanics and long res runs. It was an experience, that's for sure. My pick for TBC now has to be the dungeon that was added towards the end of the expansion actually, the Magister's Terrace, a dungeon where it had to be completed on normal to access heroic because Blizzard just loved achievements back then. It also served as a bit of catch-up gear and an additional point of interest on the Isle of Quel'Danas. Back in the day, this dungeon was always really difficult, and the amount of groups I'd joined for heroic that would disband on Priestess Delrissa, that's the PvP type boss, was crazy high. Going back in Classic, decked out in tier 6 gear and with a pre-made group, it was kind of a different story, but this encounter in particular could still really catch you off guard if your healer got hit with a CC chain. Aside from that, of course, we find Kael'thas lurking at the end of the dungeon, still ranting about setbacks as he always does before we dealt with him once again. I think Magister's Terrace wins out in part for me due to the good memories from back in the day and finally being able to beat it now, but I also think it's a solid dungeon in its own right, so that's why it's my pick here. Next up is the Shadowlands, which I feel for once is doing a little better on one of these lists than it typically does, and that is entirely because of the mega dungeon that was added halfway through the expansion, Tazavesh, the Veiled Market. The Ethereal have long been one of World of Warcraft's most mysterious and enigmatic races, so to get a look into their world for real was something that I was eager to see. From the moment you arrive on the boat to the grand entrance, Tazavesh is a spectacle to behold, but the way forwards isn't exactly simple either. From solving puzzles, avoiding guards, taking on varied boss encounters, all whilst travelling this huge expansive trade floor of goods from all corners of Azeroth just really works out here as a setting. Needing to work with different cartels for the signatures to advance feels as though it makes sense as well, and gives that dungeon another reason for progression rather than it just being through killing bosses. Even though progression is still really just tied to defeating bosses, it's just that little something extra which they didn't have to do, but they did. For a mega dungeon, Tazavesh has to be one of the standout moments throughout Shadowlands, and proof that even if the expansion overall wasn't that well received, it definitely still had good parts to it. So that's why it's my pick here. Let's go back once again all the way to Wrath of the Lich King, an expansion which definitely had a big old difference between its best and its worst dungeons. Whereas on the lower end you have the dreaded Oculus, the longer than it needed to be culling of Stratholme, and to be honest, even the Halls of Reflection. Yes, Halls of Reflection is cool the first time, but that whole chase scene has about zero replayability, I'm sorry. It's almost like they put an auto-scroller in an MMO. Anyways, for the best dungeon in Wrath, I might be picking something a bit strange here, not gonna lie, but thinking about it, I can more or less always go for a run of Utgard Keep. Utgard Keep is like Wrath of the Lich King's essence in a dungeon. You'll arrive off the boat to Howling Fjord to the amazing views, and you're at war with the Vrykels straight away. You battle through their forces, establish yourself on the coastline, and prepare to move further inland. But the first dungeon of the expansion stands in your way, and what a building the whole of Utgard Keep is too, dominating the center of the water. There are some good quests too, some of them you need to do a bit of pre-questing for, others you can just pick up. Inside it's more of a battle against the Vrykel through the forge and into the dragon training room, all the way eventually to Ingvar the Plunderer at the top, and then there's even a shortcut to the entrance so you can go again straight away. Utgard Keep is just a solid dungeon. It looks great from outside, it's got good items, it's easy to run and rerun, and it gets you started on the continent of Northrend super well. So for all those reasons, it's my pick for Wrath of the Lich King. Following that is Battle for Azeroth, quite a high entry from another controversial expansion as a whole, but one that definitely had some seriously good dungeon content. And the choice I'm going with for BFA is Waycrest Manor. Now, to be honest, I do have a bit of a gripe with how claustrophobic this dungeon could feel at times with its small twisting corridors and trash, but I think I can overlook it because if you wanted a haunted mansion type instance, this is it. The atmosphere, the enemies, the environments and so on were just absolutely spot on for Waycrest Manor, with witches casting spells, demon servants, and even a burning effigy come to life. The whole zone of Drosvar is like a bit of a time capsule in the World of Warcraft universe, of a moment in history when superstition, witch hunts and curses were seen as real, and it was all brought to life in the game in a very fitting way. Above all, Waycrest Manor is that stereotypical creepy house on the hill where people don't go and they don't talk about it out of fear and superstition. It's almost like the modern version of where Morbent Fell resides in his house up on Raven Hill in Duskwood. This dungeon as the endpoint for the zone of Drosvar was perfectly on point, and though it's a bit cramped and even maze-like inside, thematically it's so good that I can overlook any issues and say that this has to be the top pick from BFA. Which brings us to our top three. 3 expansions remain and we have 3 dungeons to pick. The third place is going to an entry from Cataclysm, the Vortex Pinnacle. I'm not sure why, but I have what can only be described as an irrational fondness for this dungeon. Vortex Pinnacle is one of the later dungeons you'll check out in Cataclysm in the Zone of Uldum, situated way up in the sky among the clouds. I think Vortex Pinnacle just captures a feeling that very few other dungeons do, in that it's just totally different to anything that had been seen in the game up to that point in time. Having a dungeon entrance so far up in the sky gives it this feeling of grandeur, and inside there are some pretty interesting encounters too, where you can definitely min-max to perform as well as possible. Whether it's moving as little as you can on the first boss to dodge the tornado walls, knowing where to stand on the second boss, and hopefully not being that guy who takes too long to walk into the safe zone on the final boss. Another big thing I enjoy in this instance is also the soundtrack, which isn't something I've brought up in this video, well, at all to be honest, but I tend to play with music on and it's always on for the Vortex Pinnacle. There's just something very majestic about it. Overall, Vortex Pinnacle gets the feeling of an elemental focused dungeon right, and it's always one I enjoy going back to, so that's why it has to be my pick for Cataclysm. At second place for me is the entry from Legion, and it's going to be the Court of Stars. You know, for Legion I nearly picked the Archway, but I realised it was about 50% because I played a Warlock back then, and watching the mobs at the start explode thanks to Soulflame was like a dopamine dispenser. If you know, you know, but I guess that by itself just wasn't enough. The Court of Stars was introduced as part of the Suramar storyline, where the player investigated further into the dealings that the Knight Lightborn were making. The journey starts off with a short boat ride to the dungeon along the waterways before making a start on the dungeon proper, but calling it a dungeon feels like a bit of a disservice as this place is anything but a dark and dank corner of the world. Court of Stars features a ton of details wherever you look and makes Suramar appear even better than it already did. There are also interesting boss fights throughout the dungeon too, often with some kind of scaling aspect where they get more difficult over time. There is also the fact that players with different professions, races or classes could interact with items throughout the dungeon to make it easier in certain ways. Druids and herbalists could pick certain flowers to give their party bonus haste, high-level cooks and Pandaren could share food with their party for bonus max health, and alchemists or rogues could poison a flask that the first boss drinks from before the fight so that he dies as soon as he tries to use it. It was a unique idea at the time and gave you a bit of extra in-game fantasy from the choices that you'd made, and you know what, I think people tend to really appreciate that in an MMORPG. Then there was of course the part at the end of the dungeon where you must identify the Burning Legion spy from the party, and you have to use a few clues which are given to you, another unique idea for this dungeon. Or you could have just brought a demon hunter along and have them use Spectral Sight, which would instantly identify the spy without you needing to do anything else. Overall, solid bosses, great atmosphere, unique mechanics and more. Court of Stars was a dungeon done right. Which means at the top spot, number 1, the best dungeon in World of Warcraft's history is going to be the entry from Vanilla, back where it all started so many years ago. And the pick here is of course the eternal, the incredible Blackrock Depths. BRD is simply the king of 5-player content in WoW, and it has been for the longest time. And with the legacy it's now built up, I don't know if anything could ever top it. It has, amongst other things, content ranging from levels 52 to 60, some of the most iconic items in the game such as Hand of Justice, Savage Gladiator's Chain or Ironfoe, somewhere in the region of 20 or so bosses depending how many extra ones you spawn and what route you take. There are multiple different routes for the dungeon for different objectives, a ton of different quests for both factions including achievements for raids. The actual entrance for Molten Core itself is inside the dungeon. It has a special furnace and anvil for crafting and so much more. A full clear of Blackrock Depths is going to be many hours in a row delving into this colossal dwarven city buried beneath the mountain, and it really feels like a full-on city from the Dark Iron Highway to the prisons to the arena to the Grim Guzzler and all the way through to the throne room where the Emperor himself awaits. BRD takes you from just the start of the endgame of Vanilla into fully raid ready, and is a part of the game that eventually everyone will be led to. And these days, since I actually have a clue on how to navigate this place, it's even better. Blackrock Depths was a mega dungeon before mega dungeons existed in World of Warcraft, but it was built in a way which was far more interconnected with the world around it through quests, achievements, crafting, and of course the story surrounding the summoning of Ragnaros by the Dark Iron Dwarves. Blackrock Depths is put on a pedestal by players for 5-player content for a very good reason, and for me it has to be without a doubt the best piece of 5-player content that World of Warcraft has ever seen. When Blizzard announced their anniversary servers to commemorate 20 years of World of Warcraft, Classic fans found out they weren't just going to be going back to good old fresh vanilla servers, but eventually will have the chance to carry on to World of Warcraft's first expansion, the Burning Crusade. As we are today, Blizzard have not currently offered a Burning Crusade experience for about 2.5 years now, and having seen the roadmap estimating a winter 2025 to spring 2026 release for the anniversary TBC realms, it's probably going to be over 3 years before you have the chance to cross the dark portal once again. I guess patience is a virtue you have to have with Blizzard and Classic. But what is it about the Burning Crusade which is making people want it back so much nowadays? Why is it remembered, and what did this expansion do so well? That's what I hope to talk about today. 10 of the largest factors about TBC which really separate it from other versions of World of Warcraft and make it stand out. For me, these have to be 10 of the best features of the Burning Crusade, and ultimately why some people can't wait for it to re-release once again after vanilla. Let's start off with some of the smaller updates to the game, but ones which very much were important at the same time, and to me were welcome. A lot of the lower level gear was reworked in a way to make it make a bit more sense, I think is the best way to put it. Notably, certain quest rewards, whether they were from the open world or in dungeons, boss drops, and profession items had updates to give people a bit more choice. I mean, I love me a cloth item with some strength on it when it makes sense from an RPG perspective, but you can never really make any use of it practically within the game, and vanilla offered you quite a few items like this as well. Then you look at how these items were changed in TBC, and it becomes immediately clear what type of class or spec would want to use this. And above all the lower level item changes were most notable for casters. As I'm sure you'll know if you played a decent bit of vanilla content, there are very few sources of spell power gear at all until you start hitting the more endgame gearing. And while spirit and intellect are great for sustaining your damage, they don't make you do more damage, only your spell ranks really do that. So these updated items allowed you to power up a bit more during that leveling portion of the game, and that's why I think these lower level gear reworks were an important part of the Burning Crusade changes. In addition to gear upgrades, TBC made changes to the whole leveling section of Classic WoW too. So when it comes to expansions, you kind of have to speed up the old content a bit, because Blizzard over the years has decided to build the content of World of Warcraft up vertically, where new very much replaces old. On top of that, certain parts of the classic leveling journey could really slow down. Notably, 40 to 50 could have gaps in experience where you kind of just run out of things to do, and this is by today's standards with all our add-ons and perfected guides to help you through leveling. First up, the Burning Crusade reduced the amount of experience that was needed as a whole to level between 10 and 60. They added a new quest hub in Dustswallow Marsh, and plenty of new quests throughout the vanilla journey as well. They also changed open world elite areas to make them much easier to solo, given the reduced number of players actively still working their way through this content. This worked for TBC as it balanced out the vanilla experience curve and got you into the expansion without it taking excessively long or you just running out of things to do. So I think overall the leveling changes were an important part of TBC. Next is a relatively fast one, but definitely something which I know I'm a huge fan of in the Burning Crusade, and that is the tier set appearances and functionality. The Burning Crusade was the first time that Blizzard made tier sets actually have choices for each of the different specs within the game, and I think this is way better than just creating a tier set which is useless for several of your classes' identities. Just think back to how in vanilla every tier set for hybrid classes is focused on healing. Okay, except tier 2.5, but Blizzard definitely had a plan when it came to raiding for these classes. It gives tier gear more usefulness, it makes them still wanted on re-clears. Oh, and it now drops as tokens too, instead of you downing a boss and it dropping your second druid tier piece for your singular druid who got their tier piece 5 weeks ago. But above all, I'm glad tier is so widely used in TBC because every class set in this game looks absolutely incredible. The art and design team created some of the best sets they've ever done in the Burning Crusade, and they really have stood the test of time. The only downside of tier is that the set bonuses are often still quite boring for the most part, and you have to go farm out Hyjal for tier 6, but apart from that, tier gear is a big win in the Burning Crusade. Next is something which I know is going to be a little bit controversial, but hear me out, because it's attunements. Attunements were a huge part of the Burning Crusade. No other version of World of Warcraft has ever featured them so prominently, and at the launch of TBC there is so much to do than just blasting through all the attunes such as Kara or starting the Trial of the Naru was just so much fun to do. The problems with attunements kinda come later on because they end up being an annoying barrier to entry to get into content on your roles. And in Classic, people tend to play a lot more alts than they used to back in the day, and having to do the whole attunement process again and again does get old, to be fair, and this is where people begin to fall out with them. Of course, back in original TBC and in Classic, Blizzard did lift attunement restrictions as time went on and allow people just to get straight into the raiding content on their roles. I think there is space here to potentially really just tie a big reward to achievements on alts, such as getting 100 emblems or something for completing a major step, so you can instantly buy a few bits of catch-up gear, as at the end of the day, achievements do keep a wide variety of content active. Either way, I think for what they were the first time around, achievements were a good part of TBC, despite their problems. The profession updates that took place in TBC were also pretty good in my opinion. So as I'm sure you know in vanilla, it's kind of just the engineering show. Engineering is king and you want it on basically every character, whether it's for PvP or PvE. It gives you amazing trinkets, unique items, nades, target dummies, charges to blow up doors, teleporters, and so much more. It is just such a stacked profession. TBC opened up a bit more choice. There's definitely still a best pick depending on your class and spec, that's just kind of how these games work, but you had more choice and I think that was a good thing. Whether it was tailoring for the Shadowfrost or Spellfire gear early on, enchanting for those ring enchants, blacksmithing to craft and upgrade your Lionheart Blade or Storm Herald, or the brand new profession, jewel crafting. There were a lot of new bonuses and a lot of interesting things to make. I mean, engineering still was a good choice and it always has been, but TBC brought other professions up a notch to compete with engineering, and I think that's where they did well here. Another one of the Burning Crusade's biggest additions to the World of Warcraft universe was the Arena, a brand new PvP mode where players of predetermined classes, team size and gear would be pitted against one another to earn the best PvP gear and increase their rating. Whether it was through 5s, 3s or 2s, Burning Crusade was where Arena all began. In fact, in TBC, 5s was actually active for once because people wanted to cap their points for the week so that they could work towards some of the rewards, which were also very good for PvE. It must be the expansion where the 5s bracket was the most played because of this, which I suppose is better than nothing if you do want this queue to pop. Arena was a more directly competitive form of PvP too, rather than unbalanced open world PvP or disorganized battleground pickup groups. It gave the top PvPers in the game something real to push towards. Also back in original TBC, PvP was just a much bigger part of World of Warcraft too, so at the time this change was super well received and made so many legendary players come up over the years. Either way, Arena revolutionized what PvP is in World of Warcraft, so I think it's definitely worthy of a mention here. Next up are orange items. You can't have an expansion be an expansion without legendary loot, and in the Burning Crusade there were 3 drops that people sought after. The main and offhand Warglaive of Azzinoth from Illidan's Stormrage in the Black Temple, and Thoridal the Star's Fury are both from Kil'jaeden in the Sunwell. Now Thoridal is super cool in its own right. In fact, it doesn't even require ammo and was the first bow to work like this till ammo was later outright removed. It also has a unique animation when fired, as well as having a great appearance overall. However, when people think of legendaries in TBC, they're thinking of the Warglaives. A weapon appearance which was just unlike anything we'd seen so far in the game. A huge on-hit effect against demons, which you aren't short of fighting in TBC, and every single warrior and rogue in the land wanted a pair of them. Did you know that back in original TBC that there was an interaction with Atlas Salute where you could zone into the Black Temple, try to retrieve information on the glaives, and if they showed on Illidan's loot table, they were guaranteed to drop. Or at least that's what people say. And no, this didn't work in TBC Classic, and yes, I'm sure that people tried it. I mean, people reset AQ40 to get easier post-twins trash. If you could have searched up glaives like this, every single rogue and warrior would have had a pair. Another big benefit of glaives is that they dropped before the last raid. Stuff like Fangs of the Father from Dragon Soul or Shadowmourne from ICC are cool, but you get to use them for one raid, and by the time you actually have finished the item, you're probably decently progressed through the raid as well. Glaives are an item that you can get early on into the Black Temple, and then have them for potentially some tier 6 progression. Zulaman, I mean, sure, why not? And of course the Sunwell. That's a lot of legendary value. Of course, the only moderately small downside is that you need both glaives to drop, and between the demand and the rarity, they are really difficult to get hold of. But for a lucky few, getting the Warglaives of Azzinoth will absolutely make TBC the expansion to remember. On to the top 3 now and into some of the big final features of TBC. At third spot for me is simply the characters that were involved in this expansion. The huge lore names that World of Warcraft players had come to know, whether it was from the RTS games, comics, books or anything else. We had Illidan's Stormrage, Lady Vash, Kael'thas, Sunstrider to Magtheridon, Kil'jaeden, Terran Gorefiend, and so many more. TBC dealt with tons of huge character names in the World of Warcraft, and it was just another thing that made it memorable. I mean, you can put Illidan's face on just about anything WoW related and it's gonna sell really well. He's so popular they straight up brought him back for Legion, and he was perhaps also the most popular character in that expansion as well. Having some kind of history with the in-game characters is something which I've definitely come to appreciate more the longer I've played World of Warcraft, and TBC introduced some truly memorable bosses and characters, so I think it is definitely worth a mention. At second place is a big update to the raiding scene. I think the Burning Crusade did a good job of hitting a balance between having a wide variety of content from easy to challenging, whilst maintaining one difficulty for all players. I'm saying this as somebody who will go for the hardest difficulty in raiding when given a choice, but I think there's enough evidence now that harder for harder's sake is not always what is best for Classic. From Ironforge.pro we can see here that harder raids just fall off player base wise. Ulduar, Icecrown Citadel, and Tier 11 in Cataclysm most notably are all what many would consider great raids, yet you can see the player base fall off as each progresses week on week. When you look back to the blocks of players consisting of vanilla or TBC here, things are pretty steady throughout. The thing about one difficulty is that everyone has access to the best available loot, so even the easier bosses will drop BIS items, and people really like their upgrades and knowing that the item that they're getting is the best, not that it's just a downgrade from a harder version of the same boss. We also played TBC pre-nerf as well, so our average difficulty in raid was significantly harder than what the vast majority of people would have experienced originally. In fact, Lady Vash and Kael'thas were both debatably only killed once pre-nerf in 2007, but so many guilds managed to beat those fights these days. TBC showed us that you can have one raid difficulty and still have challenging fights, so that's why I think it's worth a mention here. And before number one, I do have some honourable mentions, two of them in fact. I know I wanted to include both of these points and pretty high on the list at that, but I wanted to keep it to 10 main points and I kind of just ran out of room, so I'm giving them a mention here anyways. The first honourable mention goes to flying. I think this one is pretty hit or miss for people, but I knew I wanted to have it here because it's such a big feature of the expansion that I just can't ignore it. But flying lets you see the world from a whole new angle, it's very convenient, and it's just a core feature of the Burning Crusade. And don't forget your regular flying was only 60% speed too, and you never really used it unless you had to because it was so slow. Flying didn't get properly OP till you bought your epic flying, which was 280% speed. And then on top of that there were the gladiator mounts and Ashes of Alar that were 310 speed. The second honourable mention is that both factions now have access to both paladins and shaman through their new races in the Draenei and Blood Elves. It was huge giving both factions access to a whole new class and a race at the same time. It let people experience what they brought into raids and PvP and opened up many more options for players to try out, so I think this is also worth a mention. At the top spot for TBC though is the ways that the classes changed coming into the expansion, and the fact that so many more different classes and specs became viable picks in both PvP and PvE. Whether it was due to talent reworks, new spells, or tier set bonuses, you wanted to bring so many different classes to an optimal Burning Crusade raid. No longer were there meme specs when it came to performing certain roles within the game. Shadow Priest became the infamous mana battery, providing tons of support for their group. Enhancement Shaman 10% attack power and their totem buffs. Retribution Paladin 3% damage, 3% crit and their judgment upkeep. Boomkin was 5% spell crit and a 3% physical hit chance debuff on their target, and so on and so forth. Blizzard found a way to make all the unwanted specs feel worthwhile to bring to your raid. We got more choices in tanks too, as Protection Paladin became the premier AoE tank, Druids had the best single target threat, and Warriors remained strong. You wanted every type of healer in your raid as well, Druids for the innovate and party-wide buffs, Paladins for blessings and than the single target heals, Shaman for mana tide and chain heal, and Priest remained amazing as always. TBC expanded on how raid comps worked in Classic into just more than the holy trinity of tank, heal, and DPS. TBC kind of embraced 4 different roles: tank, heal, DPS, and support. Stuff like Shadow, Enhancement, Boomy, and so on are what I call support roles within the raid. They weren't there to be topping the DPS meters themselves, but they made the raid comp so much stronger just through being there that they were ultimately worth bringing along, and this approach definitely worked. Now don't get me wrong, TBC raid comps still had some issues, such as stacking shamans and rotating them for bloodlust. Your optimal raid comp became quite rigid due to group-wide buffs, and so on and so forth, but overall I have to say it was an improvement over the meta of Classic, where really it's just warrior, rogue, and mage having fun. In World of Warcraft, be it retail or classic, there's a rather clear path of content that your character is supposed to go down. From that moment you enter the world as a fresh-faced adventurer, going on quests, doing dungeons, gaining XP, learning new abilities, and so on. Eventually you hit the level cap and have a wider array of options open up, such as PvP in the arena or PvE in raids. Aside from that, over the years WoW has fleshed out content with achievements, transmog collection, Mythic Plus, rated battlegrounds, pet battles, and tons more. But some players don't really care about all that. Some players don't need a guided path. Whilst World of Warcraft may be the classic theme park MMO where you come to try out all the set-piece content, some players treat it more like a sandbox. A world separate from their own where they're free to explore, experiment, and just play the way they want. Today I want to take a look at some of the most unique ways that players have created their own game within the game, and check out the people who are famous in World of Warcraft for how differently they played the game. Warriors in vanilla WoW have a reputation for being difficult to level. They are highly gear dependent, lack rage generation early, and are super reliant on a good weapon to really start putting out respectable damage. Anyone who has leveled a warrior has that moment where the odds stack up against you and you just straight up die to a mob the same level as you because they parry or dodge about 6 times in a row. It wouldn't be the warrior experience if this didn't happen now and again. But what if picking one of the toughest classes to level was not already enough for you? What if you wanted to abandon the one thing that warriors rely on so much and tried to hit level cap without ever having equipped any items at all? Well, on 13th of February 2007, a video was uploaded to YouTube showing an individual who had achieved just that. Gutsrot the Troll Warrior. The challenge was simple: level 60, no weapons, no armor, only grinding, with Gutrot claiming about a 6-month time frame to get this done. Also, I noticed this character was on Airy Peak. That's where I started playing WoW back then as well, and I was on there for years. I guess I just never came across this crazy troll in his leveling journey. Funnily enough, if there was a class to do this challenge on though, Troll Warrior is a very good pick. Trolls get extra damage against beasts, which you can use to grind on, regeneration for a bit of extra health, and berserking scaled with missing health back then. Certain key warrior abilities work well with this too. Thunderclap or Demo Shout both don't need a weapon of course, and in the Fury tree you have Enrage, Rampage becomes more useful in TBC, and Bloodthirst doesn't actually need a weapon to be equipped in order to be used. This video gained a bunch of attention for this player, with now many rooting for him to push through TBC content and hit level 70, though Gutrot started to provide more update videos showing just how brutal this challenge was. Especially entering Outland, the choice of mobs to farm were pretty thin, and for a time he even went back to farming old zones such as Silithus or questing in Western Plaguelands. But on October 22nd, 2007, near 8 months after the first upload, Gutrot released his grand finale, hitting level 70 in Senjin Village, not far from where his journey began all that time ago. The final level was achieved by summoning an image of Archmage Vargoth to hand a quest in. This is usually part of a quest chain in Netherstorm, but I guess you can summon him anywhere. The gathering of trolls and supporters alike was so huge that the server even went offline for a brief time, something that in years to come Blizzard would start to take a bit more of an aggressive stance on. Gutrot and his crew would then go on to raid Stormwind and create a truly unforgettable night for all those involved, before leaving the video with a simple message: Thea in Northrend. The follow-up to this and his level 80 would take quite some time though, with a repost of his invitation to his level 80 ding being found on MMO Champion, dating September 16th, 2009. There is also footage of the pre-ding event online, but nothing from the famous troll himself. I think we can assume Gutrot did achieve his goal of hitting level 80 without weapons or armor, but also created a legacy for players to follow, to be insane enough to take on what he started all those years ago. And during Vanilla Classic, a player would follow in Gutrot's footsteps called Voivod, who not only took on the naked leveling challenge, but did so as an undead, hardcore, no deaths warrior, which is like playing hard mode on mega hard mode. I guess you have cannibalized to regenerate every so often against humanoid or undead mobs, but I'd imagine you're not too short on spare change because this challenge involves a ton of grinding mobs. Either way, challenge runs such as this that began all those years ago are starting to see more popularity once again through the more recent hardcore movement on Classic WoW. We'll have to see how far people can take this insanity in the months and years to come. Next is a player who I can totally relate to from when I first started World of Warcraft, Dysphoria. This player was famous for their Hunter versus World videos, where they would take on high-level dungeons as a solo player, and just see if they could overcome the odds and beat content that was designed to be done with a full party. Hunters in WoW have always been known for their ability to solo content, with tons of ways of kiting enemies, long-ranged attacks, and a pet. They're kind of the perfect class for the job. I remember having a level 30-something Hunter, and the content I did was more or less exclusively working out how to solo various Scarlet Monastery dungeons. In some of Dysphoria's earliest videos, you can see them working on a route through Dire Maul North, using their pet to reset mobs and then quickly moving through the open spaces. They would gradually advance through feigned death use and even showed off a King Gordok strategy, which is more or less exactly how people mapped out the optimal way to defeat the boss in Classic, which is crazy. To think a player had cracked this all those years ago solo with way less information on the internet is very impressive. Now, if you played a Hunter at endgame during Classic, chances are you also did some Dire Maul North runs, and there are several reasons why. It's a personal gold farm, mainly from disenchanting items in the tribute chest. You could sell items in the tribute chest too, as a player who was not in the dungeon could zone in and loot them still, or to clear it so other people could enter and gain various tribute world buffs. And whilst a lot of the run has been sped up and smoothed out, you have to hand it to the Hunter that led the way to getting these tactics down. A more recent player now, but a super unique one, and one which I suspect you just may have heard of. Double Agent. So during the Cataclysm, one of the changes made to the game was now that gathering herbs or mining would give a small bit of experience. Just a little helping hand to ensure that whatever you're doing in World of Warcraft, it's helping you progress towards your level cap. Not a big deal, right? Well, in the following expansion, Mists of Pandaria, World of Warcraft's first and only neutral race was introduced to the game, the Pandaren. Starting on the Wandering Isle, this race sees the good and bad sides of both the Horde and Alliance, and at the end of their starter journey have to make a choice to commit to the faction that they prefer. Or that is what most people would do anyway. What if you decided that all this fighting just really wasn't for you, and you would rather just remain on the Wandering Isle? One player, named Double Agent, did just that. After exhausting the Isle of Quests, the only repeatable method of experience gain left was gathering herbs or mining, and that is just what he did, requiring thousands and thousands of herbs to continually level up. This incredible journey saw him start at level 1 all the way up to 85 during Mists of Pandaria. There are two more factors that make this achievement even more impressive, by the way. First of all, there were no mount trainers on the Isle. You were expected to do this on the mainland after having picked a faction, so Double Agent rolled a Shaman in order to have access to Ghost Wolf, which would speed up this already lengthy process considerably. Second is that the Wandering Isle, back then at least, had no mailbox, and the heirloom tab didn't exist in the game until Warlords of Draenor, so we had to do this without heirlooms or a mount. And this is one of those rare occasions where the player has kept up his incredible feat of strength, tweeting in December 2022 that he had been able to achieve level 70, which is now the cap in Dragonflight, without ever having left the Wandering Isle, finishing with a playtime total of 212 days and 22 hours. Now that is dedication. Next up, there have been many players over the years who have dedicated their character to challenges forsaking the combat that World of Warcraft is often centered around. One of these is Nor or Rhynish. These were a gnome rogue and an undead priest. They were both role-played as characters that did not want to cause harm in any way and play through the game as a pacifist. As part of the challenge, they would try to keep weapon skills at 1. This was done through having a fishing pole equipped, as well as focusing on methods of experience gain that did not need combat, such as exploration, gathering quests, or retrieval quests. This was done early in TBC though, so eventually their possible XP gains did begin to plateau out towards the mid-20s on both characters. In 2.3, Blizzard released repeatable battleground quests, which technically gave this player a new avenue to continue gaining XP, where they would only heal on Priest, and on the Rogue they aimed to disrupt enemy flag carriers through CC, or carry their own flag using non-damaging Rogue abilities, as well as equipping pieces of gear such as the Green Whelp armor, which has a chance to sleep the target on hit. I wonder what the theoretical level cap with no combat would be in Classic or TBC. Everything is a lot more mathed out these days. Even still, I'm not sure this is an avenue in the game that's been fully explored. Maybe someone out there will try it one day. Till then, we have stories like this. Next up is one of those names you've almost certainly heard of at some point. It's one of World of Warcraft's most well-known players to represent a single class. I'm not sure what made them more famous, finding so many janky spell interactions, dedication to soloing content, or the fact that he was a troll when pretty much every other famous mage from back in the day was undead. I'm of course talking about Faxmonkey. Whilst hunters were good at soloing things, mages could often take it one step further, especially in vanilla with no AoE cap and elites which could often take out mages in a few hits. Faxmonkey showed how powerful Frost Mage kiting was back then, through repeatedly moving back and using Frost Nova, and just doing things which realistically very few players, let alone classes, would have been capable of doing at the time. Not to mention his one versus many PvP videos, which there's more than just a few amazing mages over the years who have been able to show just how overpowered this class really is in vanilla, or finding out that spell steal in TBC could lead to some pretty hilarious results, such as the fire shields that kobolds used in AV stacking with your spell power, which meant you could go grab a few buffs from the nearby kobolds in the mines and then just run around and microwave people. Seeing a mage just run straight into a whole pack of alliance and AoE them down in a matter of seconds, even when they're in ice block, will always be something that's memorable. There's been so many unique players and playstyles over the years that people have come up with to really push the boundaries of what both of themselves and their class are capable of. Whether it's a grind that lasts thousands of hours, soloing content, or role-playing in a certain way, it goes to show what MMOs are all about. It's that diversity of content, the ability to create your own story, and the chance to be a player who goes down in the history books of this game for making memories for so many others. In the World of Warcraft, zones are the building blocks that create the world that your character lives in. From the easygoing starter zones when you're first just getting a look into this world, or notorious zones like Stranglethorn Vale on PvP servers, where questing naturally brings together so many players of the opposite faction and there are many battles, all the way to endgame zones like the Eastern Plaguelands that are dark, gloomy, and threatening. These are the places that the game happens. Stories are told and memories are made, and each and every expansion has brought on a unique set of zones for players, from the mountains of Kunlai to open world cities such as Soromar and beyond. The zones of World of Warcraft have always been a huge part of it, and definitely always will be. So today I wanted to cover what for me has been the best overall zone of each of World of Warcraft's expansions so far. We'll also be going in order of how good the zones are instead of by expansions. So the zones towards the start of the video are great for their expansion but not the best overall, and the ones towards the end are the best of the best. So with that said, let's make a start. And we'll be starting off in the Cataclysm for our first pick here, the expansion which totally changed the whole world of vanilla forevermore. I'll also be focusing on the leveling zones from 80 to 85 here, as despite every zone undergoing changes, these were the truly new additions to the game. And you know, one of the criticisms Cataclysm gets is that it goes a bit too far with pop culture references. I mean, sure, World of Warcraft has always done this, but in Cataclysm they they forgot to do it in moderation. There was just too many of them. And if I hadn't played through Cataclysm fairly recently, I would have picked Uldum here, because I wanted this zone to be cool so badly. This had been a zone which was rumoured to exist all the way back since vanilla, and it was even tied into a quest that you complete after having done a full run of Alderman. And to be honest, even though the first half of Uldum's questing is basically an Indiana Jones reference, I still enjoyed it a lot. It did feel as though you were uncovering ancient tombs and exploring this vast desert that had been lost to time. But then eventually you reach what is roughly the second half of the Uldum questing, and you come across a character called Commander Schnotz. And at this point, as much as I hate using the word, the zone just becomes cringe. He's supposed to be the stereotypical bad guy from Indiana Jones, but it just gets way too much with how involved he is. All in all, the joke just goes too far. So unfortunately, as much as I'd like to, I can't really pick Uldum. And the rest of the zones in Cataclysm are okay to good though, I think. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna have to pick Mount Hyjal. Hyjal was a zone that was briefly visited as a raid during the Burning Crusade, and it was even a place you could access in vanilla, but this was the first time that it was brought to life as a full-on zone. It was also one of the 2 starting zones in Cataclysm as well, featuring a story that led all the way up to the opening of the Firelands raid in a later patch. Overall, Cataclysm did introduce some good zones, and Hyjal gets the pick here. Next up is the Shadowlands, an expansion which absolutely had some impressive visuals, such as when you are flying from one zone to the next from Oribos. And it's the visuals which I think are the main thing that draws me towards picking my favourite zone here, which is going to be Ardenweald. Ardenweald must have one of the most vibrant colour palettes of any WoW zone that we've seen, with more or less something standing out at every single corner you turn. The reason Shadowlands is at this point on the list though is that every zone, at least early on into the expansion, felt as though they had a common problem. They just weren't much fun to navigate without flying. Now you did end up getting flying in Shadowlands in patch 9.1, but they made you grind for it. And if you were coming back to the game, you probably had a fair bit of work ahead of you before you could access it, including a large quest chain, your Covenant story, and reaching a certain renown level. But without flying, there were just so many vertically placed areas or pathways where you had to go miles around something, and eventually it just got kind of annoying to get around the Shadowlands. Despite that, from the zones that existed and from my experience playing the expansion, I still think I'm picking Ardenweald here. Following that is the Warlords of Draenor, and here we're going to be going with Shadowmoon Valley. So Warlords of Draenor infamously had an absolute disaster of a launch, but after you got out of your garrison and into the open world, things started to improve. Shadowmoon Valley was the opening zone that Alliance players had to experience, which was a stark contrast from Shadowmoon Valley during the Burning Crusade, where it was just a total wasteland. Here in Warlords of Draenor, it's much more of a somber experience that feels as though a shadow truly has been cast over the entire zone. I think it's also one of the better attempts Warlords of Draenor had at creating a zone that showed us how Draenor would look before it became Outland. I guess the biggest disappointment with the zone is that Karabor, which you'll know as the Black Temple from TBC, was absent as it was intended to be used originally within the zone. In fact, Blizzard planned at one point for Karabor to be the Alliance capital during WoD, instead of some small forgettable camp next to Ashran. A big shame, but missing content was unfortunately a big part of what made Warlords of Draenor such a letdown for many players. Despite all that, I think Shadowmoon Valley has to be the pick here as a solid opening zone to Warlords of Draenor and a good representation of Draenor pre-TBC. After that I have Dragonflight, which, thinking about it, I'm kinda surprised which I'm putting it at this point on the list, because I think back to this expansion and the first thing that comes up is swooping around, dragon riding and taking in all of the sights. Dragonflight had to have been the most cinematic world WoW had ever seen up to this point in time, and that was definitely one of its strong points for me, but ideally the zone needs to do a bit more than just looking nice. And when I think about the moments when I'm not flying around at max speed on my dragon, the zones don't seem quite as impressive. All the same though, if I'm picking a zone from Dragonflight, I'm going for the Azure Span. I definitely got some kind of Grizzly Hills type vibes from this zone, and given the music that plays there, I don't think this was a mistake from Blizzard either. It almost feels as though it's a bit of a mashup of different Wrath of the Lich King zones such as Grizzly Hills or Borean Tundra in appearance, and I am completely okay with that. There's even a Tuskar village on the edge of the waters too. You can't get more Wrath for the Lich King than having a random Tuskar village, can you? Overall, the Azure Span is a great looking zone, enjoyed the music, and I think it was the best addition from Dragonflight. Next is World of Warcraft's current expansion, The War Within, and honestly the pick here is very close to the Azure Span. In fact, I think these two are kind of interchangeable for me. Anyways, I think there's been one standout zone from The War Within so far, and that has to be Hallowfall. One of the best moments about Hallowfall is when you first ascend up that massive cave from Ashkahet and get the first sight of the Belladar illuminating the entire zone. Hallowfall is an underground zone too, which I've historically been critical of in other videos, but because of the size of the zone and the amount of light in it, it doesn't actually feel as though you are underground. I think this was a great decision for The War Within, as there are already plenty of underground zones to go and see, so Hallowfall provided some much needed variety other than seeing another zone predominantly themed around grey rocks and obstacles. There's also a throwback to Arathi forces, which is an interesting tie-in to a very old faction in the WoW universe, and rediscovering them and why they've been here and what they've been doing was interesting to take part in. Hallowfall feels like one of the more standout zones we've seen in WoW for a while, so based on that, so far in The War Within it gets the pick from me. Following that, we're heading back a few expansions to Battle for Azeroth. For all the problems that BFA brought on with all of its tasks that needed to be done weekly, temporary power gains and more, it definitely had a bunch of good zones in it as a whole, and I think the one that was especially good was Kul Tiras. Kul Tiras is of course another throwback to a place which has existed in the WoW universe as far back as the RTS games, and in WoW during vanilla you can find Kul Tiras units in Joritar occupying a fortress that low-level Horde players have to deal with. So finally getting a chance to visit this place for real was something that I think a lot of people would have been looking forwards to when it was announced to be a zone for the expansion, and I think Blizzard did a good job in delivering a port city in Kul Tiras. Highlights of the zone include Borealis as the Alliance capital, where they really got the feeling of the city right, and it was also just super convenient to navigate without being overwhelmingly large or confusing. The soundtrack was great and memorable, and definitely added to the whole maritime themes that they had going on throughout the zone. Outside of Borealis was a snowy mountainous zone which was easy enough to navigate, had a lot of quests going on, and it was just a good time to play through for me. Kul Tiras was definitely a high point of the Battle for Azeroth expansion, and despite there being many other good zones that will be worth a mention, I think this is the best one overall for me. Next up we have the entry from Mists of Pandaria, and for this expansion the choice for me is going to be Kunlai Summit. This is a zone you'll encounter about halfway through your questing journey. This area features Pandara monasteries, huge mountain ranges to cover, and of course the Grummels. And with some not so subtle hints to the Himalayas and Sherpas and so on, this zone has always had quite a majestic feeling to it. It also stands along the wall to the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, which you still won't be entering for some time whilst you're leveling, as well as moving on to more dangerous territory further west in the Townlong Steppes. Kunlai Summit really captures that zen feeling that Mists of Pandaria tries to accomplish through its landscape, the Pandaran race, the music, and the quests that take place within it. It's interesting to see the monasteries from the outside to search for treasure in hidden places, and there's a lot of hidden treasure in MOP, and of course there's that one quest where you have to scale the tallest mountain. Overall a very strong zone, good soundtrack, and it just fits the theme that Pandaria is going for so well, so that's why it gets my pick for Mists of Pandaria. After that we're venturing back all the way again to the Burning Crusade and Outland. For me in TBC there are really two standout zones which I think are above the rest. Those are Zangarmarsh as well as Nagrand. Zangarmarsh just feels good to step into after finally being done with Hellfire Peninsula, offering you a much different perspective on this alien world. It has a good music score to it, and I've always found questing there to be pretty enjoyable, bar the one or two quests where they want you to go swimming around for 20 minutes or so. The highlight of the zone though has to be the Coilfang Reservoir, which contains 3 dungeons and a raid. What sets this apart from other raid entrances or dungeons is that you need to actually swim down through a pipe to gain access to it, which is just to this day such a cool way to enter the instances. But despite me definitely being a Zangarmarsh enjoyer for the Burning Crusade, it just has to go to Nagrand as the top zone. As an equally tranquil and massive zone, Nagrand will be one of the places that you reach a bit later during your TBC questing. Straight away the floating islands throughout the zone make it instantly distinguishable to any WoW player. In fact, these floating islands, or some variation of them at least, were found by players in a hidden section of a map in vanilla, showing that this set of scenery had been a long time in the making. Nagrand features a return from the infamous Hemet Nessingwary, who had finally finally escaped the jungles of Stranglethorn Vale to make his way here, and he and his merry band of hunters have a whole lot of killing for you to be doing this time around. Nagrand also features the Ring of Blood. This was the first instance of this group-based PvE combat arena, which would go on to see reappearances in many expansions to come, such as the Amphitheatre of Anguish in Wrath or the Crucible of Carnage in Kata. There's also the Ring of Trials PvP arena as well, which you can venture into. And far to the west are high-level demons and even some level 70 content. In fact, the only part of Nagrand that feels a bit underused is Oshugun to the southwest. Perhaps the best feature of Nagrand is being able to stack up your quest log and return with the whole screen showing as complete. And in WoW there are few better feelings than that. Nagrand has always been a good zone to revisit, and I definitely rate it highly. Which brings us on to our top 3 picks with 3 versions of WoW left to go over. At the third spot is Wrath of the Lich King, and you probably already know which zone I'm going for here. It's practically the most basic, best zone you can pick, but it's got that reputation for a reason, and I'm of course talking about Grizzly Hills. You know, when I'm thinking back to Wrath of the Lich King, honestly Howling Fjord isn't that far behind Grizzly Hills in terms of how much I enjoyed the zone. The first boat ride into the Howling Fjord from Stormwind is just amazing, the soundtrack is great, and the progression through the zone is strong too. Blizzard even tried to put some kind of Fel Reaver type roaming mob in the Howling Fjord too in the Storm Giant, but I can't ever remember getting caught out by him. In fact, the only real letdown with the Howling Fjord for me was some of the quests towards the start of the zone, where you have to use so many items that just have an obnoxiously long cooldown for no reason. The Grizzly Hills though is a banger zone throughout. Perhaps the most iconic part of it is simply the soundtrack, which was unlike anything we had heard up to that point in time. Across the land of Northrend too, Grizzly Hills is a break from all the death and or snow that you can find in any other zone. It even has a throwback to Archmage Aragorn, who has risen from the dead to control a new pack of Worgen, before you track him down and put a stop to that once again. Grizzly Hills also has a bunch of quest hubs that all feel pretty different from one another, such as the Dwarves in Dunargol to the southeast, the Troll Ruins just north of that, and even a PvP zone in Venture Bay to the southwest. Overall, the Grizzly Hills combines a great soundtrack, good appearance with varied questing, and I think that's what makes it so memorable. At the second spot is going to be the entry from Legion, and here it's definitely the best endgame zone Blizzard has ever made, and that remains true today, and that would be Suramar. Suramar followed along the story of a hidden group of Nightborn elves and took them from desperation and hiding to over time being able to reclaim their city. There hasn't been a more complete story taking place in a zone than Suramar in my opinion, and a big reason why is that not everything was available from day one. As patches progressed, more of the story was rolled out, new characters were introduced or new parts of the city. Suramar had Withered training, which allowed you to raise your own army and put them to the test, as well as some voice lines from the guards that anyone who played the expansion will instantly recognize. This zone felt genuinely dangerous at first too, because there was no flying and there were so many obstacles between the various objectives, but you really got the feeling as though you were undercover, gradually restoring the Nightborn to their former glory, as well as eliminating the Legion. And of course this all culminated in the Nighthold raid. Overall, Suramar was an amazing zone, visually great, good soundtrack, interesting questline, and a story that really felt impactful. As such, it deserves such a high spot on the list. Which means at the top spot is the entry from Vanilla, or should I say entries. I say this because originally I wanted to just pick Westfall for Vanilla, but I've realised that it's more than that which makes this part of the WoW universe so special. It's how everything is connected together between Elwyn, Westfall, Redridge and Duskwood. In future expansion, zones are more often than not just their own thing and they have their own part of the story to tell. They're designed for certain level brackets and they award loot of a certain item level. This wasn't the case in Vanilla, where you were absolutely expected to go back and forth and to visit different zones time and again. And for me, that opening quest loot for the Alliance from say level 12 all the way to about 28 is one of the best and most replayable sections of any game that I've ever played. Of course there's other zones in the mix too, such as the wetlands to get to this level, but those 4 zones around Stormwind are just what make it such a great experience. You go from a fresh adventurer with nothing in your bag to having some experience and abilities. You might find shoulder items, rings and possibly even a neck if you're lucky, and above all you'll really start to take steps into the mid-game of Vanilla's leveling content, where things only start ramping up more and more. From just getting started out and finding out about the Defias Brotherhood, to taking on the early talks in Redridge, to all the iconic quests in Duskwood, such as unleashing Stitches. Blizzard just did such an incredible job with this set of zones, and really, over 20 years later for me, this experience just hasn't been beaten. One thing that made vanilla World of Warcraft stand out across all versions of the game ever is how the world was built and the content was designed. It wasn't this meticulous, thoroughly tested and balanced world. It was much more akin to a bunch of developers having the chance to do something with a cool, brand new world with limitless opportunities. And when you take that world and bring it back over a decade later, it's amazing to see all the ways players have discovered to truly unearth every possible secret and all the ways they've optimized their characters. Take world buffs in classic WoW for example. Kevin Jordan, one of the 3 original vanilla developers and class designer for vanilla, was once asked about them on stream, to which he replied simply with, "There was no oversight for it. It was just a bunch of dudes making content that was cool, and a bunch of people working independently putting in stuff like that because it was a cool way to reward you for a quest or an activity." And that's really part of the essence of vanilla, which made it something memorable, because there was a lot of cool things that some dude had put in the game. In fact, there were loads of them. So what happens when you have an entire world of random cool things then? Well, that is the subject for today's video. So be it a quest reward, a player discovery, or other, these are some of the weirdest ways players have discovered to optimize their characters in vanilla. So early on in the Barrens, Horde players will come across Camp Taraho. Seems like your fairly standard little outpost and quest hub, but there's an NPC here that can actually provide some useful buffs even for maximum level characters. Just inside the cage near the flight path is the Quillboar Mangletooth. Players can complete a quest for him, after which they'll have the chance to hand in blood shards, which are farmed from Quillboars out in the Barrens. You can do this in exchange for several different buffs. Now, most of these buffs are pretty small, 10 extra strength, agility, or intellect, and they're not half bad for the level you can get them at. But for some reason, 2 of these buffs are not just flat stats, they are percentages instead. These are the Spirit of the Wind for 10 blood shards. This provides a 30% increase to movement speed, which is undispellable. However, it does only last for 5 minutes, so uses are very niche, if any at all. More interestingly is Razor Hide for only 4 blood shards. Now, the tooltip here is your vanilla classic. It does something, but we're not going to tell you what it does. However, if you test it in game or check online, the damage reflect is only a really small value, not worth mentioning. However, the bonus armor is 25%, and the buff lasts for 10 minutes. Now, 25% extra armor, I don't think I have to say, but it's a lot when we're talking about a geared warrior or a feral druid tank. In fact, even during Naxxramas progression, Horde guilds could take advantage of this short-term buff on the tanks during bosses which hit your tanks particularly hard, such as Patchwork for instance, making this level 14 quest reward usable on some of the hardest raiding content in the game. How about we cover some more probably unintended buff uses in raiding? Another one that was pretty widely used was the fire resist buff available in Lower Blackrock Spire. So you're going to know that Blackrock Mountain houses Molten Core and plenty of other dungeons, meaning they're all fairly close together. And the last boss in Molten Core is of course Ragnaros. Now what Rag does is a ton of fire damage, and a lot of it is unavoidable fire damage, between Lava Splash for some random AoE and Wrath of Ragnaros, which has a nasty knockback on it, which can then even chain knock you into lava. It's a good idea to bring some fire resist, add a little bit of leeway where your gear may be lacking on those first few kills. Also definitely worth a mention, resistant stats in vanilla were very important on a number of bosses. The higher your resist stat went against a certain element, the higher percentage chance you had to reduce damage taken by a certain percentage, which all averaged out, and it scaled with how much resist gear you wore. But what if you could get a bunch of resistances for free, allowing you to keep on more combat effective gear? Well, you could. Inside of Lower Blackrock Spire were Scarshield Spellbinders. Players found that you could mind control these mobs and then use their fire resist buff on others, adding a huge plus 81 fire resist buff to raid members, which would last for an entire hour. Adding on a fire resist totem or aura for an extra 60 would leave you around 141, which without any other resist going on would reduce damage taken on average by around 33%, which isn't half bad. Oh, and in case you're wondering how long it took to buff if you needed your entire raid to go into a dungeon, well, in Classic you could take 10 people into most dungeons. You could 10-man the Dead Mines if you really wanted to. Who knows, just Classic things. There were also some mobs in Eastern Plaguelands which did something quite similar called Scarlet Medics. However, their buff was for 1 hour of extra arcane resist, and a boss we needed tons of arcane resist just never cropped up in Classic. We had Rag that needed fire, Viscidus needed nature, Sapphiron needed frost, and so on. And if you ever did need this arcane resist buff, it would have been super easy to get, as these Scarlet Medics are just standing around in the open world. There was also a buff from Black Fathom's Deep, strangely enough. Now, I don't think many active raiders went out of their way to get this since, well, Black Fathom's Deep is really in the middle of nowhere, and this buff is right at the end of the dungeon. But you can click an orb called the Altar of the Deeps after the last boss and gain a small 1 hour buff that gives you some extra intellect, spirit, and 15 extra frost spell damage. Mages were actually playing Frost early on during Classic in Molten Core and Blackwing Lair because they're both full of bosses which were immune to fire, and 15 extra damage at that early stage of the game is not as bad as it sounds. Also, at the end of Black Fathom's Deep, there was this random NPC that would teleport Alliance players to Darnassus, and for Horde, it's Hearthstone Hall Walk. The final random buff I want to go over here came on quite late in the game when AQ40 was released. As part of a new World PvP event, random dusty red looking nobs would spawn out in Silithus. Players could click on these and carry them back to their nearby faction camp. When you were carrying them, you couldn't mount or gain any movement speed increases. I guess the overall idea here was for you to go and hunt down enemy faction players trying to turn in and steal them for yourselves. Anyways, once you successfully hand in, you'll get a buff called Traces of Silithus. This short 30-minute buff would provide a further 5% damage to melee and spell damage, which means, at least according to the tooltip, no buff for hunters as attack power was split into melee and ranged back then. Unfortunate. Oh, also fun fact, this buff was eventually banned on Warcraft logs for Classic due to the fact you'd have to get this buff last after all the others because it only lasts 30 minutes, whilst in a zone where you were auto-flagged for PvP on PvP servers and you couldn't mount. The griefers would have been out in full force to catch people out with world buffs there, so I think overall the idea was to save themselves a bit of sanity. Moving on though, quest rewards. This was peak random dudes doing some cool stuff design. Many of these items are just insanely overpowered despite being able to be farmed at a lower level. Many of these were even tradable for a time, though none of them were during Classic due to us playing on the final patch. Biggest of all is so many of them were faction specific. I have 2 interesting ones for the Horde and 2 for the Alliance. Horde first. We need to start off with a level 6 quest. A lot of these really weird items come from very low level content actually. This was available near the undead starting area in the town of Brill. The quest A New Plague had you go out and simply farm some fins from nearby murlocs. Upon handing in, you were given 5 slumber sand, which could be used to instantly put a target to sleep for up to 20 seconds. And of course this is Classic, so we don't have silly things like level restrictions. It worked on any player of any level, and of course getting a 20-second escape that's instant cast on a 1-minute cooldown, that's not half bad. But this was just a one-time quest for the Horde only. Or was it? Well, no, actually, anyone could go and farm these items. Dust Devils out in Westfall were fairly rare mobs that roamed around the zone, and they have a low chance to drop magic dust, which does the exact same thing. So if you really wanted some of this stuff for example, opening the chest in the middle of the Gurubashi arena, you very much could go and farm it. The other Horde quest reward I have in mind was from a level 5 quest called A Solvent Spirit from Senjin Village, just outside the Valley of Trials. This had you go and collect some items from nearby crawlers and Makura. The quest reward was 10 times really sticky glue, which instantly routed a target for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Just like the sand, pretty handy tool to have in your bag when you need to make a heroic play in a battleground or just outplay during a gang. But the items the Alliance got were arguably even better. Starting off in Goldshire, we have the quest Gold Dust Exchange. For this you need to, surprisingly, go and collect some gold dust from a nearby kobold mine, and this quest is available at level 4, mind you. The reward was a bag of marbles with 10 charges, of course it being on a 1-minute cooldown like everything else, and its effect was to reduce the target's chance to hit by 25%. These were tradable right up to the final patch of World of Warcraft, and I'm pretty sure they were made bind on pickup because of Nax Ramus progression, and even in Classic some players save these for Nax, and that's because this 25% hit chance reduction effect, for some reason, worked on raid bosses. Old Wowhead had comments pointing out how good this would be on Mexner, for example. Imagine Web Spray having a 1 in 4 chance to miss you, or what about Patchwork Progression? Cutting his hit chance down by that much is like giving your tank a huge mitigation boost. It was a truly unique and niche item, though it's pretty clear to see why it was eventually made by Don Pickup. The final item is arguably the most single powerful one-use quest reward consumable which has ever been put in the game, and for once this isn't a super low-level quest, nor was this item ever tradable as far as I could tell. This was a reward from the level 25 quest Mage Summoner, and it gave the Light of a Loon, which is more or less a paladin bubble in a bottle. Any class in the game could go completely immune to all spells and effects for 10 seconds. To this day, some people still have this sitting in their bank, waiting for that time when they need to be the one person alive at the end of a raid encounter or to survive some impossible battle. Be careful when you use it though, this item only has 1 charge. Let's move on to some weird raid optimizations. So you'll probably remember back in Classic, Shaman was Horde only, Paladin was Alliance only, and that created some big differences in the raiding and PvP scenes. Horde had the terror of the Elemental Shaman globaling you in a battleground, as well as a nice easy ride on Viscidus thanks to Poison Cleansing Totem, whilst Alliance had tons of passive support tools from the Paladin, as well as a healer that once had late game gear quite literally could not go even if they tried. So Holy Paladins had this talent called Illumination, which made it so when their spells crit, they gain 100% of the base mana cost. Or in other words, the spell was free. This effect was so powerful, it got nerfed to 60% effectiveness in TBC and down to 30% in Wrath. You can already tell how busted it would have got late game. But whilst Alliance raids were able to go non-stop thanks to a never-ending supply of healing, Horde were not. Their counterpart Restoration Shamans didn't even have Water Shield back then. Due to this, Horde speedrunning guilds had to start getting pretty creative when it came to finding ways to keep themselves moving forwards in a race, and it was during the opening night of Naxxramas 40 in Classic where one such Horde guild on North America, Onslaught, showed exactly the extent that you could go with this. Consumable use has always been a talking point in Classic, and during this raid Onslaught went through, for example, 231 Greater Shadow Protection Potions, 170 Greater Frost Protection Potions, and 46 Flasks of the Titans. But most surprisingly was the fact the healer team overall used 133 Flasks of Distilled Wisdom. Now back in Classic, unlike Wrath of the Lich King, flasks were not cheap. Each needed around 40 herbs total, as well as a Black Lotus. These were rare spawns in high level zones, so popping a flask really felt like a commitment. That being so, how did they go through 133 in one night if it's a 40-man raid? Well, you see, back in Classic, Distilled Wisdom didn't just increase your intellect as it did in TBC and beyond, it increased your maximum mana by 2000, as in if you were on 0 mana and you pop one of these flasks, you're now at 2000 mana. I think you can see where this is going by now. Players in these guild were chain popping flasks which could have easily cost around 150 to 200 gold worth of materials as if they were mana potions, and you could spam flasks. They had no cooldown other than the global one, of course. And again, if you think 100 to 200 gold sounds expensive now, you probably want to count a good 8 to 10 times inflation between then in Nax 40 and now in Wrath of the Lich King Nax. Still, in the end, they got World First Horde Naxxramas 40 for putting in this extra effort, and that out of raid preparation was really what Classic speedruns were all about. It's stuff like this why people remember vanilla, and with today's far more min-maxi oriented MMO crowd, so much more of it has been uncovered. Raiding has been a cornerstone of World of Warcraft's endgame for as long as it has existed as an MMO, from 40 players, 10 or 25, heroics, mythics and more. Over the years, players have stopped a whole host of villains from destroying or taking over Azeroth in one way or another. After all, a major patch just isn't a major patch without some new raid, alongside the story, bosses and of course loot that comes with it. At the same time, some of the raids that have been added to the game have definitely been better received than others, and everyone has that raid from back in the day, or perhaps even the most recent one where you think that it is the most standout addition to the game. So today I'm going to be covering what is for me the best raid of every single version of WoW so far, all the way from vanilla to the most recent content in the game. So with that said, let's make a start on this. We'll begin back in the humble days of vanilla, when Blizzard were taking their first steps into creating raiding content for this game that would still be going all these years later. So I think my pick for vanilla might be a bit bit of a strange one because I'm actually going with Zul'Gurub. If there's one classic raid I want to go back and do time and again, it's the random 20-player troll catch-up raid dropped in halfway through the game. And you know why I'm picking ZG? It's because nobody really cares about it. I think how try-hard things tend to get with 40-player raiding has spoiled the experience a bit for me. Where there's no challenge from the raiding content itself, it instead becomes all about the efficiency, speed, and passes that you can obtain. And this attitude has just become more common over the years. 40-player tends to involve a whole lot of gold farming, and I don't know if you've seen the prices of stuff on Anniversary Realms, but it's really expensive over there, on top of the burden of farming world buffs. And both these elements set a bit of a timer on how fast you need to get through the content, as well as making dying in Classic the most punishing it is in any version of WoW ever during a raid. But then you look at ZG, do you need to get full world buffs for ZG? I mean, personally, I'll probably turn up with Oni and ZG, as they don't take much effort to get, but Diamond Tribute and Songflower? Nah, I'm not gonna do that, and neither does anyone else really. Does anyone flask or pop a dozen consumes for ZG? Also no, nobody really cares enough to do that. There's no speed running, there's no passing, there's just going to the raid, having a good time, clearing the content, and hopefully you get an item. It's what classic raiding should be. I do understand the whole consumable requirements and world buff meta in Classic though. I've been there and I've done that, believe me. It's the same reason why people only invite more meta specs to Mythic Plus, or ask for an achievement from a raid in order to join a raid. It's just human nature to actively mitigate failure where possible. But overall, ZG is the chill raid to do in Classic, so for that reason, and pretty much that reason alone, it gets my pick. Next we venture beyond the Dark Portal into the Burning Crusade. World of Warcraft's first expansion saw a big jump in the difficulty that raiding content had, whilst also keeping things at 1 difficulty for all players. I think if there's one thing which holds a lot of TBC raids back for me from being the pick here, is annoying trash. Blizzard really had a thing with making trash excessively difficult in TBC, whether it was in heroic dungeons where trash would do more damage than bosses, and that is not an exaggeration, or indeed the raids where a bad trash pull could easily lead to a wipe or needing to res a bunch of people. When I think of trash, I basically think downtime between bosses where you can chill a bit and just press your buttons and talk with people, and often in TBC that's not really what trash was. This was especially true in Serpent Shrine Cavern and Tempest Keep. You remember those trash mobs before Solarium where you'd have to have your shamans AFK round the corner from the raid, otherwise they could get mind controlled and pop heroism? Now that's a fun mechanic. Or how about the spinny mobs before Kael'thas, where your mages had to literally spam polymorph on them the entire time you were in combat, because if they start doing their spinny thing, your melee players are going to instantly die. Or the giants at the start of SSC that would do so much random melee damage around them that your melee players just had to wait outside and let the range deal with them. Or the skeletal valets in Karazhan that would stun your tank and do about half their health, then swap to somebody else and one-shot them. But I think you get the point. But in TBC, for me the best raid either is Karazhan or the Sunwell. Karazhan is of course the classic pick for TBC. It's perhaps one of the most unique raids WoW has ever had, and even saw a resurgence as the first 2-part mega dungeon in World of Warcraft's history during Legion. The only real downsides to it are perhaps a couple of those annoying trash packs which I've mentioned, the chest boss just isn't very interesting after the first time, and a lot of the loot in there is pretty average. Sunwell on the other hand is a bit lacking in environments, with 2 of the bosses being fought in the exact same area, on top of the trash not being easy, but also not being incredibly annoying as other trash mobs have been. Overall I think I'm going to go with Sunwell, but just by a narrow margin. The bosses in there were either solid to good. It felt like one of the first raids ever where Blizzard really went all out to make near perfect loot for various specs within the game, and it was just a fast and fun raid to do. So for overall in TBC, I'm going to go with Sunwell. Next we ventured to the Frozen North in Wrath of the Lich King. This time it's an expansion where I do have a bit more experience both from back in the day and from Wrath Classic this time. And at least during Classic I was able to clear all the content, which has definitely impacted how I perceive the expansion. So really it's going to be one of the major tiers which I'm going to pick here, and the 2 frontrunners have to be Ulduar and Icecrown Citadel. At the same time I've done both of these raids a lot now, so I do have some notable downsides about both which I couldn't help but notice. For Ulduar, the hard mode loot system added 1 extra item to the boss's drop table, and on top of that 10 and 25 had different loot. So actually seeing the item you wanted could take, without exaggeration, months. Also, the normal mode only bosses felt quite obsolete after a couple of resets and just things that you had to do that were in the way. Problems with ICC included the Shadowmourne questline. I'm just gonna say it, legendaries that modify how a boss fight have to be done is not good game design, especially when on most bosses you just had to AFK and wait until said player had done the thing they need to do. And in Wrath Classic we were making so many more Shadowmournes than they were back in the day because Blizzard sped up how fast you can get them, so this ended up getting really boring to wait through time and again. The second major problem is that Sindragosa Heroic is possibly one of the worst boss fights I've ever seen in World of Warcraft. Well, that's if you're a caster or a healer, and I was a caster, so it was. There was a debuff during this fight called Wild Magic that lasts for 30 seconds. It made it so whenever you cast a spell you got a stacking debuff, and at the end of that debuff you'd explode and do a lot of damage to everyone around you. And due to various positioning requirements during the fight, the optimal play to do when you got this debuff was just to do nothing for 30 seconds. This was followed by an air phase where the boss would fly away and encase 3 people in blocks of ice, and guess what you're doing when you're in a block of ice? That's right, nothing. If you got unlucky on this fight, you just didn't play your character. I've had pulls on Sindragosa where I'm just AFKing for 5 minutes straight, not doing a single thing. It is so bad. Anyways, weighing in on those two and reminiscing a little bit, I think despite the downsides, it's still going to have to be Ulduar as the top pick, but not by as big of a margin as you would expect. What Ulduar did well, it did really well. It gave you that feeling of actually properly invading an ancient facility, from the start of it with the best vehicle fight of Wrath of the Lich King, which is a bit of an oxymoron, then onto XT, and then the Antechamber and beyond. The music in Ulduar was just majestic, and it set the atmosphere amazingly. The hard mode bosses added a bunch of twists to certain fights, and made them a bit more interesting, and you had 2 legendary encounters in there in Algalon and Yogg-Zero as well. I'd have liked the raid to be a bit more generous loot-wise and for all the bosses to have a hard mode, but other than that, I think Ulduar stands its ground as the best pick of Wrath of the Lich King. Which brings us on to Cataclysm, another expansion where both heroic raiding and dungeon difficulty spiked once again. So before Cata came out, I will be that guy singing praises saying that tier 11, that being Throne of the Four Winds, Bastion of Twilight and Blackwing Descent, was probably one of the best opening raid tiers WoW has ever had, and it was overall a great experience. So has that stood the test of time? Well, it has. Kind of. I think just blanket saying the whole of tier 11 was good though is the part that needs a bit of a revision, because Throne of the Four Winds is most certainly not it. I found Conclave of Wind very frustrating as everything can be going fine on your platform, but somewhere else something keeps going wrong and you just have to wipe again and again without really feeling as though you're doing anything wrong personally or knowing why. And then you get to Alakia with its incredibly RNG phase 1 where all the mechanics can just line up and sort of one-shot you. Phase 2 was fun though, but phase 3, that's the flying one by the way, was just kind of scuffed. Having that verticality just didn't translate mechanics visually all that well. Also, pets would just despawn on phase 3, and I was playing a Warlock ult at the time, and just to have my pet, which was my main source of damage, not exist on the final phase of the fight is honestly not good enough considering how many classes in the game had some form of pet or guardian. But the 2 remaining raids were overall good, even though pets also didn't work properly on Sinestra, and they could have problems on Nefarian too. You know what, thinking about it, I wouldn't pick something with a pet again in Cata, that's for sure. But both Bastion of Twilight and Blackwing Descent were a good challenge on heroic mode, had plenty of good loot, and perhaps raiding here was the most rewarding it has ever been. I was doing 25 heroic at the time, and if you killed a boss it would drop 6 items between 25 players. Back in vanilla you get about 2 to 4 between 40 people. I'm kind of split between the two, but I think I'm going to have to pick Blackwing Descent due to a few overall more interesting boss encounters and fights which could change as your raid geared up some more. But tier 11, apart from Throne of the Four Winds, does stand the test of time. Next of course is Mists of Pandaria, where we'll be going pretty soon on our classic journey. Another expansion not short on good raiding content, with I think the 2 contenders for the best raid in this expansion being between the Throne of Thunder and Siege of Orgrimmar. Throne of Thunder had perhaps one of the best 1-tier villains ever in Lei Shen. It had an epic feeling to it, and classes were just fun to play during Mists of Pandaria, which certainly helped out, but you could very much say that for any raid tier. Overall though, I think I'm gonna have to pick Siege of Orgrimmar. This was the big final tier of the expansion, finally bringing Garrosh, who some would say did nothing wrong, to justice after his destructive journey throughout Pandaria. Siege of Orgrimmar offered some super interesting bosses, such as the Corcoran Dark Shaman, Siegecrafter Blackfuse, or Paragons of the Claxi, and in Paragon specifically, the Dungeon Journal probably has more text than entire raids would have done in Classic. I remember tier set bonuses being fairly interesting in Siege of Orgrimmar, as well as us finally being able to get our legendary capes and putting them to good use. There are definitely some criticisms against Siege of Orgrimmar too. Galakras would become kinda boring on farm because you had to wait between the waves. I'm not a huge fan of split your raid in half type fights such as Spoils of Pandaria, and it's a 14 boss raid. I believe only Naxxramas has more bosses than it, Nax has 15. But Siege of Orgrimmar, especially on Heroic, is going to take you a whole lot longer than any version of Nax ever would. But perhaps the biggest issue was the duration that this raid was current content back in the day. Siege of Orgrimmar was your go-to raiding content for a rather astonishing 1 year and 4 months before Warlords of Draenor finally released. Despite that, I remember it being an overall fun raid, both through the available bosses and how classes were to play. I was on a Resto Druid back then, so that's why Siege of Orgrimmar gets my pick for Mr. Pandaria. And then we venture ever onwards to the Warlords of Draenor, an expansion that held so much promise from a return to Draenor pre-TBC to see how things were back then, but an expansion that ultimately just couldn't keep up with the ambitions that it promised. Nevertheless, the raiding scene was one area where it's generally agreed upon that this expansion excelled, but out of the 3 major tiers you can pick during Warlords of Draenor, for me the best one has to go to Blackrock Foundry. Blackrock Foundry was kind of weirdly dropped in WoD before the first major content patch for some reason. I guess Blizzard thought something big needed to be added, seeing as, well, WoD wasn't all that good when it came to having content, you know, exist. But Blackrock Foundry would see us take on the heart of the Blackrock War Machine and to shut down their operations, as well as to take on a Warlord of Draenor, Blackhand. This raid even had a return from Gruul as an early boss throwback to TBC as well, on top of a ton of memorable fights. From dodging Orgorger in his rune, to Franz and Hans with their chaotic boss room which was constantly moving, to Operator Thogar, the one boss fight in WoW where you could just straight up get one shot by being hit by a train. Finally, the Blackhand fight was a multi-phase encounter where the boss would gradually destroy the floor, leading you further down into the heart of the mountain until you reached its fiery core. Blackrock Foundry showed some true creativity from so many of its bosses and deserves to be applauded as an excellent addition to raiding in World of Warcraft. In some ways, it's almost a shame that this raid took place during Warlords of Draenor when so much of the player base had already bowed out among a poor expansion launch, and it being clear there wasn't all that much content beyond the initial release. But for those who stuck through WoD and played this tier, they will more often than not tell you that it was worth the wait. So I think that's why Blackrock Foundry deserves the top spot for WoD. And following Warlords of Draenor, we ventured to the Broken Shore in Legion. This expansion started so much of what is modern World of Warcraft, from World Quest, Mythic Plus, and so much more. And it wasn't short on raiding content either. But I already know what is for me certainly going to be the pick for Legion, and that is without a doubt the Nighthold. Legion got off to a bit of a rough start when it came to raiding with the Emerald Nightmare, which to this day is still the easiest mythic raid tier ever. Blizzard simply underestimated how powerful our characters were going to be with their new legendaries, as well as having the ability to spam Mythic Plus and More of Souls for days upon end. But Nighthold redeemed the expansion in such a huge way. This raid released alongside the progression of the story that was taking place in Suramar, and their struggle against their leaders who had sided with the Legion. And it had so many good bosses too, from the kind of weird but wonderful robot butler Trilliax to High Botanist Talarn with his mirror images, all the way to Grand Magistrix Alessandra as the penultimate boss encounter. She also dropped a little trinket called Convergence of Fates, which has to be one of the most powerful trinkets ever made in World of Warcraft. I remember even the LFR version for some specs were better than anything else you could get. The reason why is it gave attacks the chance to reduce the cooldown on your major DPS ability. So also stuff like Avenging Wrath, Battle Shout, True Shot, and so on. And pre-nerf early on, this trinket was like halving the cooldown on your big DPS ability. Anyways, as the final boss, we at last got to do battle with Gul'dan, a true fight against a Master Warlock featuring tons of demon adds, a lot of positioning requirements, and a rather epic arena for the fight as well. Of course, most memorably on Mythic difficulty is that there was a secret phase where Illidan's soul was unleashed as the demon within, which the players also had to defeat. Overall, the Nighthold was a great raid in the story of Legion, had some super interesting loot and amazing bosses, and this one may just be a top 5 raid ever for me, so it's definitely going to be the winner in Legion. Following Legion, we head over to the Battle for Azeroth, which was probably one of the expansions with the most raiding content we have ever seen, with Uldir, Battle of Dazar'alor, Ashara's Eternal Palace, and Ny'alotha the Waking City. On top of that, it had a mini raid in Crucible of Storms too, so you were not short on raiding content during BFA, whatever you thought of the expansion overall. And for me, the top pick here is Battle of Dazar'alor. As the second tier of BFA, this raid saw an escalation of hostility between Alliance and Horde forces, where you would swap at times to the opposite faction for certain bosses during the raid. Though the real factor that made this raid memorable for me are some of the bosses towards the end of the raid, notably the fights versus Alliance faction leaders High Tinker Mechatalk and Lady Jaina Proudmoore. Mecha had some of the most crazy mechanics I've seen in a WoW boss. For example, periodically a bunch of players would become shrunk and they could be squished if stepped upon by normal sized players. While shrunk, you had to jump into bots that were periodically summoned into the fight. Whilst you were in these bots, each player would see a coloured symbol over other bots' heads, and you had to communicate what these symbols were to players in those bots so that they could enter the correct shutdown sequence in their own bot. Aside from that, there was just a lot going on in this fight, and it was pretty hectic, but very good at the same time. The best fight though had to have been Jaina herself, where you do battle on the frozen seas. Here there was a ton of frost-based mechanics to dodge, because if you ever got hit, you'd be turned into a block of ice and have to be broken out by allies. There would also be a frost storm that would occur at certain parts throughout the fight that would near totally block out your vision and make other parts of the encounter more difficult to deal with. I think this fight really got the feeling of fighting a master of frost magic right, and alongside the Mechatalk encounter, these were two great parts of the raid for me, and ultimately that's what makes it my choice for BFA. Following BFA, we enter the Shadowlands, and I think the choice here is a pretty easy one. I mean, when you're picking against the Sepulchre of the first ones, the Sanctum of Domination, or Castle Nathria, I think I know what most people would pick. So for me, it's gonna be Nathria. This raid really leaned into a whole gothic, noble, vampire type fantasy, which I would not have expected from World of Warcraft anytime soon, but it really worked. I mean, there were one or two problems with the raid tuning wise, looking at Sludgefist and Stone Legion generals here, but other than that it hit the mark. From managing the artifacts on Zymox to straight up having an intermission where you had to perform a dance on the Council of Blood, Nathria had some great encounters, and if Lei Shen served as a great one-tier villain for World of Warcraft, perhaps only Syed and Athreus has been more memorable, and he may very well return in a future expansion too. I would not be surprised to see it. Either way, Shadowlands felt as though it really hit the theme it was going for with Castle Nathria, and alongside that it definitely had some memorable bosses, so that's why it's the pick for me here. Next up is Dragonflight, another expansion with 3 main raid tiers to pick from, and here I'm going to be going with the final one, Amir Drasil, The Dream's Hope. Dragonflight became a bit of a holiday to a different world and a different story with some very picturesque locations, and one of its main antagonists was Fyrak the Blazing, who unlike the bad guys throughout Shadowlands had a bit more of a direct motive for what he was doing. He wasn't there to save the universe from a bigger danger or out of any necessary evil, he was just there to blow everything up, and you know, sometimes that's all you really need from the bad guy. I mean, it felt welcome after Shadowlands, that's for sure. Amir Drasil itself was released alongside us finally getting a glimpse into the Emerald Dream, and I think it represented it well after having been a location that was teased in the WoW universe as far back as vanilla itself. The raid also provided a great watch when it came to the race to World First, which I know isn't exactly tied into the raid directly, but I'm counting it anyway because it's memorable for this tier. Overall, Amir Drasil was a solid raid to close out Dragonflight and showed us a bit more of the Emerald Dream, so that's why it gets my pick here. Finally, we have the War Within, and for the War Within, I feel as though I still want to see a bit more of what the expansion has has to offer raid-wise. The story is heading in quite an ethereal direction at the moment, and whilst we have had some ethereal type content in WoW before, such as some dungeons in TBC and Tazavesh in Shadowlands, we've never had a full-on raid themed around them or seen their homeworld. But if that doesn't happen during the War Within, an expansion named Midnight, which is set to be the next one for the retail version of the game, does sound very fitting. Out of the 2 raids we've seen in the War Within so far, I'll probably lean towards Nerebar Palace over the Undermine personally, but I don't really have strong reasoning for one being a clear winner over the other, so overall we'll see what else the War Within gives us.